Once counted amongst the Emperor's Chosen, the warriors of the 14th Legion were originally known as the Dusk Raiders, a name they earned through their brutal dusk-time assaults across Terra and beyond. They were warriors of an unshakable fortitude, grim, tireless, and relentless. But that was before their reunion with their Genestealer Mortarion, and before their unfortunate fall. Following their unification with Mortarion on the toxic world of Barbarous, the Legion would adopt a new name, the Death Guard. This change would mark more than just a symbolic shift, as it was a harbinger of what they would become. Mortarion, shaped by his childhood of hardship in Barbarous's poison-choked mountains, reforged his gene sons in his own image, impervious to pain and obsessed with endurance. During the catastrophic events of the Horus Heresy, Mortarion would cast aside his oath to the Emperor and align with the War Master, not because of how he was treated, but rather due to his undying hate of all things Psyker. The Death Guard would become one of the 9 traitor legions, as Barbarous itself would later be annihilated amidst the fires of rebellion. In the wake of its destruction, the Legion vanished into the warp, re-emerging on a new homeworld, the Plague Planet, deep within the Eye of Terror. Here, a transformation took hold. In their quest to transcend mortality, the Death Guard, in no small part due to Typhus being rather underhanded, gave themselves to Nurgle, the chaos god of disease, entropy, pestilence, and despair. What followed was no mere corruption, but rather an utter and complete metamorphosis. Their once pristine armor now festered with boils, rust, and rot. Their flesh eternally slogging off and regenerating. Their bodies playing host to every known contingent, yet feeling no true pain, no fear, no weakness, as their bloated forms were essentially moving corpses. These fallen angels would now become what is colloquially known as Plague Marines, Nurgle's chosen instrument of war in the 40th millennium. They are virtually unkillable, though not invulnerable. Their resilience is what makes them nearly immortal. Their existence is a form of eternal suffering, masquerading as immortality. Diseases do not consume them, rather, they sustain their mind and body through eternal rot, decay, and pain, to the point that said pain is what actually allows them to resist the pain of injuries through combat. Amongst themselves, they still call one another unbroken, a grim reminder to an identity they yet refuse to shed, even as their bodies have decayed to the point that the beings who they once were no longer exist, untouched by time, by sanity, or by the cries of their former brothers. Their primarch is now a towering demon prince of Nurgle, and he commands them with an iron will only dulled by entropy. Mortarion, once a bitter idealist shaped by hardships, now serves as a vessel and a slave for the very decay and warp-fueled magics that he once loathed. We know the Death Guard as plague-ridden terrors of the Long War, their names synonymous with rot and despair. But before their corruption, before the heresy, they were paragons of endurance. They were the Emperor's shield against the galaxy's harshest of threats. And at the center of it all was one man, one legend, whose origins still cast a long, poisonous shadow over the galaxy. The Death Guard were once hailed as the strongest and most enduring of the legions of Astartes, warriors shaped by the image of their primarch Mortarion, forged from his very genetic essence. They inherited not only his resilience, but his grim outlook and fierce independence. Mortarion's strength, however, was not a gift freely given. It was earned on a world almost designed to kill. That world was Barbarous, a death-shrouded planet where thick clouds of toxic miasma perpetually blackened the skies. The human population was forced to cling to life in the lowland valleys, trapped beneath the weight of poison and fear. High above them, nestled in keeps that pierced through the densest layers of these toxic clouds, lived the overlords, beings whose true nature remains unresolved both in historical record and in legend. Whether they were mutated remnants of humanity or something wholly alien is unknown. What is certain, however, is that they were capable of surviving the lethal atmosphere that grew more deadly with altitude. That, and that they wielded powers far beyond mortal comprehension, to the point that they were sometimes even referred to as necromancers. Amongst their many unnatural abilities was the almost complete dominion over the realm of death itself. Found and raised by one of the greatest of these overlords, whose name Necare would embody dread for Mortarion, the nascent Primarch was trained to be a living weapon. Necare taught him the ways of war, tested his limits, and molded him in silence. Yet he withheld from Mortarion the truth of the people of the valley who lived far below the mountain's heights. It was only when the young Primarch defied his father and descended into the lower strata that he discovered the truth. Fragile and terrified humans preyed upon nightly by the same type of creatures that had raised him. Mortarion's realization ignited something deep and ephemeral within him. Though initially met with suspicion and fear, he proved himself to the lowlanders. His body built to breathe the very lethal air that limited all others, and it marked him as far more than human, but it was his spirit, marked by righteous fury, that made him theirs. The nearly unshakable loyalty Mortarion would earn from the natives of Barbarous is best exemplified in the excerpt from one of his very own death guard, as he recalls a life that he barely remembers anymore. In the later years, he will never remember how the next thing happened. He will not recall even if he landed a blow, or if he was kicked away and sent skidding through the mud. This part is hazy. This moment, when the balance of fate tripped over, is vague to him forever, clouded by the stagnant mist that birthed it. But he remembers the newcomer's face, a face emerging from the fog, cowled like a human's, gray and drawn, the skin sucked tight over lean bones. Brox is on the ground by then, his breath knocked out of him, his eyes staring. The newcomer striding into battle, charging out of nowhere, swinging a scythe like Brox's father did, two-handed back and forth. He is huge, not as huge as a Pale King, but far greater than any mortal man, and the power in those reaping arcs is incredible. He has already wounded the Pale King, cut it open, spilling the massive entrails over its flabby stomach, and he is not stopping. He is pressing on, driving it back, goading it. The Pale King tries to respond, but it is too slow, too slack, and its smiles are ripped from it. Brox gets up, his lungs burning. He is bleeding, but barely feels it. The spike is still in his hand, and he tries to use it, jabbing at the Pale King's monstrous foot. His efforts are useless, but he keeps at it, trying to drive the sharp point in. The newcomer is unbelievably fast, unbelievably strong, whirling around and sending his cloaks flying like flails. The Pale King is lowing now, blubbering, weeping blood. Impossibly, it is being killed. Other settlements see this and join in the attack. Suddenly, they are hunters, not fodder. They strike out, barely believing they are doing it, and the Pale King reels, bewildered by the change. In truth, however, none of them matter. Vrox does not matter. It is this newcomer who is doing the work. He is single-handedly carving the monster into ribbons, using that scythe in ways Vrox never dreamed possible. He harries it back into the fog. He cuts it apart in there, throwing out specks of blood that halt and shiver on the stones. Eventually, the bellowing dies out. The whoosh of that great sickle stills. Mist then closes over the scene of the carnage. As if abashed by it, Vrox is on his knees, exhausted, staring into the murk. The rest of the survivors stare at one another. Vrox begins to wonder if it has been some kind of cruel dream. He begins to wonder if the newcomer was a phantom sent from the heights, just another trick played by this world that loathes. But then the cowled figure reemerges, unbowed, as tall as a sheaf of uncut corn. He looks barely troubled by his exertions, his hood fallen back a little, revealing gray, smooth flesh. It is the most beautiful face Vrox has ever seen, like theirs, but as hard and clean as stone. The newcomer looks directly at Vrox, and the intensity in the yellow eyes makes him want to blush, or laugh, or burst into tears. Bravely done, says the newcomer. Vrox cannot reply, as he feels his heart will burst. But then he remembers the death. He had seen his father killed, and rushed to find his body. His mother is motionless, along with many others. He is an orphan, and that is as good as a death for him too. Now the cold becomes unbearable. He looks one way, then the next, and every view sinks further into desperation. Vrox expects the newcomer to leave then. There is nothing to keep him here, for the settlement, having been stripped of its best workers, will likely cause it to wither before the winter. But he does not. He remains with them, lifting the wounded from the earth and carrying them back into what remains of the shelter. Vrox hangs back, on the verge of shameful tears, not knowing what to do or where to go. Eventually, the survivors gather in the old courtyard. Raigan, the headman, too blind and ill to fight, shuffles down to his knees before the newcomer, but is prevented by the gentle extension of a giant hand. No kneeling, the newcomer says. The time for that is long over. He turns to the rest of them. I show you a new way, the way of endurance. You have no weapons, I will give you weapons. You have no armor, I will forge armor that does not fail. You are sickened, he smiles, and it is chilling. That too can be a strength. They are hanging on his every word. His voice is strangely soft, thin like a gust of rain-frozen wind, but it is pure with conviction. Vrox has never heard a voice like that. It was the earliest memory he had of his primarch, his gene-sire, Mortarion. He became their warlord, their champion. He took their terror and turned it into resistance. Under his command, the hunted would become the hunters. Fortress by fortress, overlord by overlord, Mortarion brought ruin to the monsters who had ruled since time immemorial, until until only Necaer remained, and the final citadel lay in the uppermost regions of the atmosphere, and was so saturated with poison that even Mortarion, a being who could inhale what would normally melt steel, could not endure. Yet he still tried. He climbed higher than ever before, driven not just by vengeance, but by the need to finish what he had begun. Unfortunately, he would fail, as he would collapse gasping at the edge of death. Mortarion would then be unable to reach his former master. In that moment, salvation came, but not from within, as the Emperor of Mankind had arrived on Barbarous, radiant and powerful, untouched by the decay that had so crippled Mortarion. The Emperor descended and struck down Necaer with a single blow, and the people rejoiced, as they welcomed him not merely as their liberator, but as a god. Yet Mortarion did not celebrate. Where the others saw majesty, he only saw contrast. The Emperor's bronze skin and noble bearing against his own pale and gaunt form, the ease of which the Overlord was slain compared to Mortarion's failure. What followed was not a conversation, but a challenge. If Mortarion could slay the final Overlord of Barbarous, the Emperor would leave him and his world in peace. If not, he would join the Great Crusade. Mortarion's failure would eventually seal his fate. Bound not by loyalty, but by duty and defeat, he joined the Emperor and his armies, leading to the seeds of the future betrayal to begin to take root. It was a test no mortal could survive, and though Mortarion was no mere man, even he reached his limits. At the edge of death, vengeance would slip through his fingers, and with it something far more dangerous: purpose. In the waning hours of Barbarous's long and bitter history, Mortarion ascended into the heights of the most poisonous layers of its death-laden atmosphere. Armed with nothing but determination and his superhuman body, he climbed towards his former master, Necaer, to fulfill the Emperor's challenge. As the gases thickened and reality grew dim, the primarch's body, though engineered to endure, began to fail him. His lungs, so used to the miasma of lower Barbarous, could not draw breath in this rarefied stratum of concentrated toxins. At the very moment Necaer prepared to strike the final blow, in golden light he would appear. The Emperor of Mankind, unbothered by the poison choking the skies, stepped forward and ended Necaer with a single swing of his flaming sword. Mortarion, denied his vengeance, would be forced to bow to fate, but submission did not equate to loyalty, as the Primarch's soul twisted in that very moment, as resentment grew in a space where triumph should have lived. Following this fateful encounter, Mortarion would be reunited with his legion, which the Emperor had allowed him to rename the Death Guard, honoring the mortal army that the Primarch had once led in the defiance against Barbarous's overlords. Hardened by the toxic crucible of their homeworld, the new members of the Death Guard quickly proved to be one of the most unyielding forces within the legions of Astartes. Campaign after campaign, they would prove themselves the anchor of the Imperial battle line, combating the enemies of humanity in a stoic resilience that would become a symbol of the Imperium's immovable will. And this would be best exemplified in the first independent action that the Death Guard took under Mortarion's command, the chilling conquest of Gispeller, a campaign where the Death Guard and their newly anointed Primarch, Mortarion, would conquer a pocket empire anchored by the teeming hive-world of Gispeller. This was a defiant bastion of humanity that dared spurn the Emperor's light. When explorator vessels and Imperial emissaries ventured forth, they were met not with open arms, but with volleys of fire, a grave insult to the Imperium's dominion. For years, cautious Imperial officials hesitated, wary of Gispeller's might amidst the other savage wars within the sector. Yet into this stalemate marched Mortarion and his freshly reunited Death Guard, their souls ablaze with the need to prove their worth. To Mortarion, the iron-fisted tyranny of Gispeller's overlords mirrored the suffocating chains he'd shattered on Barbarous. Without herald or hesitation, his fleet descended upon the system as a scythe leading through the void. The outer ramparts of Gispeller, a lattice of asteroid fortresses and blazing fire ships, crumbled before the Death Guard's relentless advance. Mortarion, eschewing the lesser worlds, set his sights unrelentingly on the capital hive. His flagship, the Fourth Horseman, a 3-kilometer-long, veritable harbinger of doom, leading the charge. This monstrous assault would crash into the upper spires of Gispeller's primary hive, sundering its lofty towers and disgorging 11,000 Death Guard Astartes directly into the heart of the fray. In a mere night and day, the hive fell, its streets awash with the blood of every man, woman, and child who dared resist. The slave soldiers of Gispeller would be ill-prepared for such horror, as they would recoil in dread as the Astartes' ceramite-clad forms shrugged off their pitiful stubbers and lasguns, forcing them to retreat to fortified ramparts. Yet they found no sanctuary, only death. The Death Guard pressed forward with grim precision, annihilating every counterattack and leaving ruin in their wake. Their phosphex bombs unleashing clouds of corrosive terror that choked the life from the very air itself. Even as the enemy fled into the hive's dark and toxic depths, the Legion hunted them down, their slaughter unrelenting. With the primary hive secured, the Death Guard tech marines seized the planet's orbital defenses, silencing them with a cold efficiency that paved the way for more reinforcements descending from orbit. However, it seems that the residents of this world did not learn, as from Gespeller's secondary hive surged a desperate counterstrike. Tens of millions of soldiers, bolstered by thousands of rumbling tanks, became a tide of defiance against the Death Guard's iron grip. Mortarion would answer with the thunder of warships, raining down devastation from above upon the massed ranks below, shattering their resolve in the open field. One by one, secondary hives were encircled, besieged, and stormed. As the Death Guard were deaf to the cries of surrender, Mortarion, having had his heart forged in the crucible of Barbarous' very cruel battlegrounds, offered no quarter. His forces pursued the broken remnants of Gespeller's armies, ensuring none survived, yet victory still bore a bitter cost, as the Death Guard suffered grievous losses, including the first captain, Avantis Brasden. When Imperial support fleets arrived, they gazed upon a world reduced, aghast at the carnage wrought by Mortarion's hand. The oppressed masses of Gespeller, long crushed beneath their former masters, bent the knee to the Imperium without a murmur. And in the surrounding systems, every world trembled, submitting swiftly upon hearing of the Death Guard's arrival, seamlessly succumbing to the Emperor's rule, haunted by the specter of the Death Guard's wrath, to the point that even a year after Mortarion's rediscovery, as the Emperor attempted to gift him with a legendary weapon from his very own armory, Mortarion would deny the gift chosen by the Emperor, instead choosing another weapon, one that he would carry straight into demonhood, Lantern, and that event would go as follows. You refused my token? The Emperor's words were mild, but there was a warning buried amongst them. In a day of protocols broken, would this be one too many? Mortarion considered that as his gaze ranged around the room and settled on a weapon sitting in a plasteel cradle. A pistol, a heavy drum-shaped firearm made for hands of something bigger than a man. It was cast out of copper, brass, and steel, and the form reminded Mortarion of a craftsman's tool. This was not the overwrought rendering of some weapon artist. It was a killer's device, industrial and heavyweight. Without asking permission, Mortarion went to the gun and gathered it up. I do need a pistol, he allowed. He looked closely at the frame. The parts of the mechanism were disconnected, and he automatically set to the task of putting it into working order. The Emperor frowned. The maker of this weapon called it Lantern. He told me before I put him to death. What did he do to deserve such a fate? The man led a cult of killers on a manufacturing world known as Shenlong. They said they worshipped a dragon. His father's gaze grew cold. It became necessary to destroy them in order to ensure the compliance of the planet. Mortarion found the control mechanism for the gun and activated it. The lantern came to life in his grip, instantly biolocking itself to his genetic imprint. It sat well in his long-fingered hand, and he sensed the raw, deadly power humming from within its casing. This will do, he intoned. It fits you well, allowed the Emperor, slowly putting aside the scimitar he had intended to gift his son. Take it then. Use the lantern to cast the light of our Imperium into the darkness. One token serves as well as another. He gave a nod. Once again, my son, you find your own path. You mean I defy the plans others have for me? Mortarion said the words without looking up from the gun in his fist. The room seemed to grow colder in the wake of his reply, and all unspoken things between the two of them clouded in the air like ghost smoke. I am here, said his Gene Father. Is there something you wish to say to me, Mortarion? Speak your mind, if you will. There were cords on the belt around Mortarion's waist, and he used them to fashion a lanyard from which the lantern could hang. I have many questions, he said at length. His voice rasped in the sudden quiet of the domed chamber, but I will dismiss them all for now, to know the answer to just one. Tell me why you took my victory from me the day you came to my world. A rare flash of confusion flickered in the Emperor's eyes. I did it to save my son's life. You would have died up there on the mountain. The fiend who tormented you for so long. The only victory would have been his. He studied Mortarion for a long moment. I could not let you perish, not after spending so long in search of you. And yet it was your challenge that sent me there, was it? We may still have much to learn about one another, my son, but one thing is clear to me. The Emperor pointed at Lantern. Is there anything in your life you have done that has not been an act of rebellion, of defiance? You faced Nakar by your choice. The door was already open. You prevented me from stepping through. He knew what you would do, said his inner voice. He made you. After all, who better to know how to play you? A chilly, unknowable distance settled in the Emperor's manner. A father is beholden to educate his sons. You learned a valuable lesson that day. I saw I had to remind you of your humility, Mortarion. There are some enemies you cannot defeat alone. Never, the silent voice bellowed in denial. Never admit defeat. Mortarion looked down at the weapon in his hand and considered the potential of it. For one giddy second, a dark and terrible question came to the forefront of his mind. What if I turned this on him? What would happen then? In the next second, the unbearable, unconscionable question melted away. In this place, there was emptiness. In the yawning abyss of emotions, Mortarion saw a dim candle of need, an unformed want calling out for connection, for kinship. He crushed that sentiment without hesitation. He had brotherhood and fraternity amongst those he had shed blood with, and perhaps he might find it in the hearts of the primarchs, his brethren in the days to come. Given his gene-father's ways, Mortarion did not doubt that others of his siblings might share a measure of the ambivalence he felt towards their shared progenitor. The Emperor allowed you to be taken when you were just a child. Then he found you again, only to diminish you. And for what? To mirror what Nakir had done? At least the Overlord had been honest about his cruelty. Will you look beyond this, Mortarion? The Emperor offered his hand. Will you fight by my side in the Great Crusade, my son? I will. He took the offer, and the pact was made. I have no choice, he added. Yet, even Mortarion's resolve could not insulate him from the events that would come. When the Horus Heresy ignited a civil war across the galaxy, Mortarion, still nursing his resentment towards his gene-sire, cast his lot with the War Master Horus. It was a betrayal born not from a shared ideology, but rather a bitterness, a slow, corrosive poison that mirrored the ones he had breathed on Barbarous. As the traitor legions made their way towards Terra, the Death Guard's fleet would be swallowed up by the warp. There they would encounter more than time distortion or navigational hazards. They would be assailed by a warp-borne disease and pestilences so foul that their legendary durabilities failed them, thanks to one of the most traitorous second-in-commands of any legion, Typhus, once Kalas Typhon, lord of the First Plague Company and host of the Destroyer Hive. What would begin as coughing fits and fever would evolve into a grotesque metamorphosis as the Astartes' bellies distended with corpse gas and their skin slothed away as the once proud warriors were reduced to delirious husks. What precisely transpired within Mortaria's soul remains largely unsolved. However, reconstructions of the event go as follows. Swear your loyalty to me. Bowed down upon one knee, Mortarion could not hold up his gaze towards the black, placid mud of Barbarous, and he looked up into the shining eyes of the newcomer. The stranger's words seemed to stop the passage of time. An aura of power, vast and barely contained, cracked about him. He looked into Mortarion's eyes, and he saw into the murky depths of his soul, to the lost and the forgotten places within that Reaper of Man, kept hidden even from himself. Mortarion's jaw stiffened. He did not want to become an open book. He did not want to give your fealty to the grandfather. Bowed down upon one knee, Mortarion could still not hold his gaze towards the rusted, broken steel of the Terminus Est, and he looked up into the menacing eyes of the great entity that swallowed the wild sky. The god thing's utterance made the strings of reality hum and resonate. A dark ether of corruption was falling like thick sleet, thickening the space around him. The entity calling itself the Grandfather filled Mortarion's lungs with spores of living death and opened him up from within, tearing apart sealed spaces to find the rich meat of his unseen fears and his most secret hopes. Mortarion's fists clenched as he could feel his soul stripped bare. You have chosen the only path you can, said his father. You are my son. You are my champion. I have waited so very long for you this day, and this day's dawning has long been awaited. Time and moment past and present. The structures of them crumbled and turned into sand, smothering Mortarion in the elsewhen. He was there on Barbarous, and it was decades gone, and he was there in the utter instant of the Imperium, together and separated, divided and merged. His father, the Emperor of Mankind, his patron, the Lord of Decay, Nurgle, beckoned to him, offering Mortarion what he could not refuse. His oath and his honor forbade him from taking any other path from this moment forward. He had sworn to bend the knee to the stranger at the lodge if he could not defeat the High Overlord. and he had vowed to protect his gene sons and his legion beyond all else. Mortarion struggled, frantically trying to grasp the truth and the lies, desperate to separate the ragged, deathly present from the echoing ashen past. Which was his reality, or were all things true? What price is an oath given in madness? He whispered words, he howled them into the void. What do you want, my son? What do you want, my champion? The voices merged into a single tantric reverberation through his bones and his physical form, into the bounds of his turbulent, unquiet psyche. I want to endure. Then rise, said the stranger. Rise, Mortarion. There is a brotherhood awaiting you in the stars, the likes of which you cannot comprehend, and with it a purpose that will illuminate the galaxy, a crusade upon which your name shall be etched into eternity. Then rise, the grandfather told him. Rise, the prince born of death. Vengeance awaits you in the realm of man, and with it the blackest, most dire purpose, a slaughter by which your name will be feared, until the last human soul fades to entropy. Mortarion said the vow without reservation. I will give myself to your banner, my blood and my bone, the unbroken force of my will and the power of my spirit. These are yours to command if you grant me deliverance. His hand found the damaged, cracked blade of his war scythe, and he gripped it hard enough to cut metal and draw blood. By this I so swear. He looked down and saw the transformation take hold. A force of immeasurable, mutational power crashed through his physical form and overwhelmed the pitiful limit of his flesh and blood. Mortarion tore away, rising to his feet, changing with each heartbeat. From his spine burst pestilence, insectile wings that quivered and cracked with the new change. His soul soaked in the corrupting energy, dying and living, reborn and obliterated. The flesh of his gaunt features pulled tight, dragging his mouth into a riotous grin, the smile of death itself. He would endure. Welcome home, said the voice. Mortarion had called out for deliverance, and something in the imperium had answered. And when the Death Guard finally emerged from the warp, they were no longer the Emperor's sons. The shining white, gray, and off-green of their warplate had been stained with filth. Their forms no longer merely transhuman. They had become plague bearers, avatars of disease and rot. Each warrior had become a carrier, a vector for the most virulent strains that the plague god Nurgle could devise. Cursed to a deathless state of eternal decay, they found a new purpose in the spreading of pestilence across the stars, not in conquest, but in contamination. In the aftermath of the heresy, Mortarion would lead his now corrupted legion into the Eye of Terror. While other traitor forces splintered into countless warbands, the Death Guard remained remarkably intact, a testament to their unnatural endurance and the ironclad structures that Mortarion had instilled within them. Deep within the warp, he had claimed a world and remade it into the image of Barbarous, christening it the Plague Planet. From this festering throne world, the Death Guard would continue their assault, often emerging through the Cadian Gate to spread Nurgle's virulent gifts across Imperial sectors, their tactics becoming infamous. On more than one occasion, newly manifested plagues, unknown to even the orthobiologists, would ravage Imperial lines in mere hours before the Death Guard's assaults would arrive. These synchronized biological and physical attacks have constantly sown devastation across dozens of fronts, slaying countless of warriors and tainting innumerable worlds. Meanwhile, the larger galactic tragedy continues its cycle. The Emperor of Mankind, following the terrors of the Age of Strife, had sought to end human division and prepare humanity to survive the threats of chaos, Xenos, and their own destructive nature. The Great Crusade was to be the culmination of this great vision, a galaxy-spanning campaign led by his Space Marine legions, commanded by his sons, forged in part from the veterans of the Unification Wars on Terra. They were to be more than soldiers. They were to be exemplars and architects of a new order under the Imperial truth. Yet one of the greatest of those exemplars, the Death Guard, fell, and in doing so they became the very threat that the Crusade was meant to extinguish. Warriors forged in fire, long before they bore gene seed. When the Emperor came to claim Terra, he did not simply conquer. He calculated, absorbed, and redirected. Old Albia was not destroyed, it was repurposed. But the question remained, did the soul of that ancient realm ever truly yield? To truly understand the origins of the 14th Legion, who eventually would become the Dusk Raiders, and later the Death Guard. One must look back into the brutal fires of the Unification Wars, and the shadowed legacy of a realm known as Old Albia. Before Terra flew a single banner, Old Albia had stood as a realm of towering industry and iron-willed warrior clans. Seated deep in the northern Atlan wilderness on the continent once called Europa, it was here among soot-blackened cities and martial enclaves that some of the most enduring bloodlines of the pre-Imperial Terra were born. Clans as old as the strife they perpetuated. These were people hardened by centuries of war against both invaders and each other. Their loyalty was to blood, iron, conquest, but not ideology. When the Emperor initiated the creation of the legions of Astartes, the strength of such lineages could not be ignored. The first wave of gene recruits for the nascent 14th Legion were drawn predominantly from Old Albia. So fruitful was this source that its warrior stock was also siphoned, albeit to a lesser degree, in order to fill the ranks of both the Iron Hands and the Night Lords, the 10th and 8th Legions, respectively. But it was the 14th who were shaped most deeply by Albia, by its culture, its scars, and its refusal to kneel. The Emperor's decision to recruit from this hostile yet highly capable population was born not purely of pragmatism, but from a greater strategic motive. Though Albia had pledged allegiance to the Unification War, it had once rivaled the Emperor himself for dominion over Terra's destiny. By drawing their brightest and most dangerous into the Imperial war machine as a whole, the Emperor not only harvested peerless warriors, but he also ensured that those same warriors could never again pose a threat from within. His second aim was far more subtle, but lo and behold, no less vital. Albia's military legacy was vast. Its warlords and soldier scientists had already overthrown the crumbling remnants of the Pan-Pacific Empire, toppling the descendants of the once so-called unspeakable king, Northan Doom. These men and women carried with them the same ancient arsenal of martial doctrines and genetic potential, which were assets that the Emperor would not waste. By subsuming their martial traditions into the legions of Astartes, the Emperor preserved their brutal efficiency while redirecting their loyalty towards his own vision of mankind. Yet assimilation was not immediate. When the forces of the Unification War marched north, they were met not with submission, but with outright war and unending resistance. The Albians, proud and unyielding, refused to exchange one overlord for another. Against the Emperor's Thunder Warriors, they deployed steam-belching proto-dreadnoughts, heavily armored Ironside battalions, and advanced battlefield tactics honed over centuries. Engagement after engagement saw Imperial forces stalled. With each Albion defeat, the Emperor was drained of mountains of resources. It was not fear that stalled the Emperor's hand, but respect, as he recognized in Albians not just resistance, but value. Crushing them utterly would demand a grinding war of attrition, yielding only ash where he sought foundation. Instead, he offered a ceasefire and extended the hand of negotiation. And remarkably, the warlords of Albia answered not with capitulation, but with agreement. Thus was born the first tradition of the 14th Legion, the Dusk Raiders, shaped in the tumult of Albia, blood-bound to a past they did not fully relinquish, and tempered by the hand of the Emperor himself. They would carry traditions of their forebearers into the stars, not as warlords, but as warriors of the Imperium. Should you find this report enlightening, make sure it is known to the Ordo Algorithmus by engaging with the transmission through comments, hitting the like button, and subscribing to ensure continued access to sanctioned knowledge. There are moments in history when a single decision alters the trajectory of an empire, not through conquest, but through restraint. What followed the Emperor's visit to Old Albia remains one such turning point, one cloaked in silence and marked by transformation, then echoed in every bolter round fired in his name. Against the counsel of his most seasoned generals and strategists, the Emperor of Mankind chose diplomacy over domination. Clad not in battle plate, but in simple robes of white and crimson, he walked alone into the warlords' parliament of Old Albia, a place where oaths had been sworn and sealed in iron and betrayal reaped in blood. Unarmed, he addressed them directly. What was offered was not simply an alliance, but absolution. The Emperor spoke of a reborn humanity, free of tyrants, united under one banner, banner and unshackled from the cycles of internecine war. His vision, ambitious and absolute, promised not only glory amongst the stars, but redemption for generations of kinslaying and tribal vendettas. To the astonishment of his own retinue and the silence of Imperial command, the Albian warlords unanimously accepted. Joining the Imperium, old Albia did not vanish, but rather it evolved. The clans, long considered to be too dangerous to trust, became some of the most fervent supporters of Imperial unification. They yielded their ancient secrets, their forges, and most critically, their sons, offered willingly to become the first Astartes of the nascent 14th Legion. From the outset, this legion bore a martial character distinctly coded in the Albian traditions. Their tactics mirrored those of their Ironside ancestors, methodical, disciplined, and brutal. These warriors were not built to maneuver or outflank. They were designed to endure. Clad in unadorned grey power armor, they served as the Imperium's hammer, capable of holding the line or breaking through an enemy with sheer grinding attrition. In defense, they were unmovable, standing shoulder to shoulder beneath storms of unending fire, willing to fight to the last bolter shell, the last breath. In offense, they were remorseless, delivering wave after wave of assaults, excelling in close-range engagement where the cost in blood was steepest. Their advance was not swift, but inevitable. As their legend grew, so did their heraldry. Their previous plain armor began to carry marks of rank and modifications drawn from ancient Ironside iconography, a quiet nod to the legacy they never fully abandoned. More tellingly, they painted their right vambrace, gauntlet, and pauldron all in a deep crimson, the color of drying blood. What once had marked the merciless reach of the unspeakable king and his enforcers now proclaimed the right hand of the emperor's justice. Their name too was forged in battle, as in the final campaigns of Terran unification became the first forays into the Great Crusade, the 14th Legion gained an epitaph from those who had survived their assault. Said epitaph was the Dusk Raiders, and it was not a title they resented, but rather they embraced. The name was drawn from an Albian tactic, striking at twilight, when the shifting light would confound the senses and sentries of their enemies, all the while they would advance cloaked in darkness. At dusk, the enemy's vigilance would wane the most, and it was there, in that fragile threshold between day and night, that the Dusk Raiders would excel. Such was the reputation of the 14th Legion that even before the first bolt was fired, enemies, given the choice to surrender to the Dusk Raiders, often faltered. In the twilight hours, when their arrival was signaled, not by horns, but by the sudden retreat of the sun, enemy garrisons would unravel. Reports tell of defenders abandoning fortified positions en masse, some casting down arms in a panic, others fleeing blindly into the wilderness, all to avoid the unyielding advance of these grey armored warriors. The Dusk Raiders had become a symbol, not just of victory, but of an inevitable defeat. And yet, as brutal as they were on the field, the Dusk Raiders carried themselves with a rigid, almost austere sense of honor. When the terms of surrender were met in good faith, they adhered to them without hesitation. Symbols of truce were respected. When a foe yielded early and was deemed worthy of Imperial compliance, they were spared annihilation. To those who bent the knee, the Dusk Raiders were not reapers, but redeemers. But that honor has limit. To the aberrant, the mutant, and the Xenos, there would be no mercy, no quarter, no negotiation. In these instances, the same steadfast will that upheld their traditions and treaties became a cold doctrine of extermination without pause or pity. When battle was declared in full and the window for peace closed, there was no force in the stars that could stay the Dusk Raiders' hand. For 8 solar decades, the 14th Legion fought in this manner. As the other legions were reunited with their long-lost gene fathers, the Dusk Raiders remained amongst the few orphaned Astartes without a guiding paternal figure. In that absence, they looked inward. What emerged was a legion entirely self-forged, proud, reserved, and utterly reliable. Their victories multiplied across compliant worlds, each campaign further cementing a reputation that even their brother legions regarded with a mix of admiration and respect. But the day long anticipated would eventually come, the long-delayed return and reunion with their primarch. Unfortunately, this would not deliver the glory or unity others had found. When it came, the event cast not a light but rather a macabre shadow of death over the legion. What should have been met with celebration became the beginning of the end. The proud traditions and identity of the Dusk Raiders, which they had cultivated for decades on end, were systematically dismantled, reshaped beneath a new vision. The cohesion, heraldry, and even the name all swept away. Under this weight, the Dusk Raiders were not elevated, rather they were erased, and from their remains, only the Death Guard would endure. Some origins are shrouded in silence, while others are buried in ceaseless screams. The investigation into the Death Guard now has us turn to an unlikely location, a hellish planet known in Imperial records as Barbarous, a place cloaked in caustic mist and ruled by powers both ancient and unnatural. It is there that the next chapter of the 14th Legion's transformation begins, with the discovery of their Gene-Sire. On this blighted world, the population had long since fractured into two distinct groups. First, the oppressive beings of immense psychic power and might, along with a mastery over death itself, commonly referred to in scattered records as overlords, though their exact classification remains contested since many Imperial record keepers seem to believe they are just a deviation of humanity, rather than an entirely unique species of Xenos. These necromantic warlords wielded terrifying sorceries and unnatural sciences, commanding undead constructs and mutated thralls to enforce their dominion. The second population was altogether more human. Settlers marooned countless millennia before, reduced to a desperate existence. These valley dwellers lived in perpetual fear, confined to a narrow band of breathable air, in particular terrain where the breathable air settled, and where the noxious fumes of the planet's upper reaches could not penetrate. For generation upon generation, they existed under the heel of their masters, scavenging a living while watching their loved ones stolen to serve as flesh for the overlord's twisted experiments. It was into this world of darkness and despair that one lone infant fell from the skies, a child of unnatural resilience and a destiny beyond mortal comprehension. This child would not be found in safety or shelter, but amongst the dead. Discovered by Nakar, the most powerful of the overlords, the infant was found wailing on a battlefield strewn with corpses, where any other human would have perished in minutes. The child survived, his lungs unbothered by the planet's toxic fog. Cautious, perhaps even impressed, Nakar claimed the boy as his own, naming him Mortarion, in common tongue, child of death. Nakar did not merely adopt Mortarion, he crafted him, as the High Overlord sought not only to groom a successor, but to create a weapon. Mortarion was raised in a towering fortress, at the absolute threshold of his tolerance, ensuring constant suffocating hardship, which would shape the child into something far beyond mortal limits. Meanwhile, Nakar would withdraw to an even higher peak, where not even Mortarion, whose resilience was legendary, would never be able to reach. This was a perch from where he could rule and observe. Rather quickly, Nakar noted that Mortarion grew at an unnatural speed and had an insatiable hunger for knowledge. His intellect was as sharp as a scythe wielded by the warlords of this world. Under Nakar's tutelage, he absorbed everything: the arts of battle, tactics, metallurgy, and even arcane sciences, along with forbidden lore. But this brilliance, Nakar found, would come with an ingrained defiance. As Mortarion's awareness deepened, so did his questions his father refused to answer. Why were the valley people haunted? Why were the dead not allowed to rest? Why did the overlords require constant suffering to maintain their power? And to these questions, Nakar offered no answers. But Mortarion, child of death and son of war, would not remain silent forever. On the death world of Barbarous, where the skies were thick with corrosive fog and the whispers of the dead, the child came by the necromancer Nakar had grown into something his master never intended: a warrior who would not kneel. Denied answers to his questions, Mortarion, the lost son of the Emperor, made his choice, and in a moment of defiance, when a caravan of valley dwellers was being dragged towards the heights to be subjected to Nakar's grotesque experiments, Mortarion broke the chains of his confinement. He shattered the gates of the fortress he had once called a home, cutting down the undead constructs, guarding it with a cold precision unlike that living beings could normally. At his side at this time was a man named Callus Typhon, one of those he had risked to save at a great cost, who in turn had become a guide. Together, he and his guide descended through the lethal fog and into the valleys below. It was there that Mortarion discovered the truth. The oppressed, the hunted, were his people, not some lesser creatures as Nakar had claimed it to be, but rather humans, his kin. From that moment on, Mortarion swore an oath not of vengeance but of liberation. At the first valley, the people regarded the gaunt, pale giant with suspicion as he bore the bearing of the mountain lords. Yet none of them had ever come down to help, but fate had delivered him a test. When a pack of mutants, twisted slaves of another overlord, fell upon the village, Mortarion stood with the peasants, a harvesting hand already cruelly and crudely forged in his deadly hand, and with said scythe he carved through the monsters in a brutal silence. The overlord who had sent the beasts watched with arrogant amusement, that is, until Mortarion stepped into the fog itself and just kept coming. Where all others would have succumbed, Mortarion endured and advanced, and so the overlord died, screaming into the very mists he had once ruled. From that day on, Mortarion was no longer a stranger. He was a liberator, a teacher, and a warlord. As he began campaigns not only of war, but of transformation, village by village, he forged strongholds from hovel, trained farmers to fight, and began to mold survivors of Barbarous into an army, from which he chose the strongest and most enduring to forge into strike teams. This was the genesis of what would become the Death Guard. With blacksmiths and craftsmen by his side, Mortarion directed the construction of armor designed to withstand the deadly atmosphere. Every engagement providing pivotal new data, new lessons onto how to push further into the poisonous height. Together, man and machine were shaped by war and corrosion. And still, one peak stood above all others, the final bastion, the citadel of Nakir, and it was within a summit that remained shrouded in toxic winds, too dense even for Mortarion's gene-forged physiology to bear. After years of liberation and grueling warfare, Mortarion stood at the very edge of victory. The peaks of Barbarous, once a citadel of tyranny, had begun to fall to his death guard. Only one remained, the highest and most venomous of the summits, Nakir, the man who had raised Mortarion, and the necromantic overlord who still reigned, watched over the proceedings with a mortifying grin. However, Mortarion hesitated. Despite Nakir's grotesque cruelty and the years of torment he had wrought, the man had once taken Mortarion and named him Child of Death, shaping him in his later years. Mortarion had planned to storm the field of the final citadel. Despite Mortarion's plans, he would call off the attack. Returning to his capital, Mortarion expected reverence. However, instead he found whispers. The villagers spoke not of his victories, but of a stranger, a radiant figure who had descended from the stars, offering salvation to the world, a world who he had bled to free. In the central hall, the stranger stood amongst the elders, his presence calm but immovable. Mortarion, bristling with defiance, declared the Barbarous required no salvation, but its own, along with the statement that he and his warriors would finish what they had started. The stranger listened, then offered a challenge to the cloaked warlord in measured authority. If you can destroy the High Overlord, he said, I shall leave this world, but if you fail, you will swear your allegiance to me, to the Imperium of man. Pride and honor questioned, Mortarion accepted, against the protests of his closest warriors. He ascended to the Death Shroud peak alone, his purpose now not only conquest, but vindication. He sought to prove himself as stronger than Nakir, stronger than the poison that had once bound him, stronger than the very legacy of cruelty, but the summit proved too much. The air in Nakir's citadel was a lethal tide. Even Mortarion's customized and upgraded armor, designed through years of adaptation to the planet's wasteland, metal corroded, flesh failed, as Mortarion staggered forward, shouting challenges through collapsed lungs, until, that is, he fell at the very gates of the fortress. In his final moments of consciousness, he saw the towering figure of Nakir approaching, a weapon in hand, but before the killing blow could be delivered, a streak of golden flame descended from the skies. The stranger, the one who had dared question Mortarion's strength, intervened. With a single blinding thrust of his sword, Nakir was slain by the weapon raised in fire. When Mortarion next awoke, the truth awaited him. The stranger was no mere wanderer. He was the emperor of mankind, his true father by blood and destiny. The orphaned son of Barbarous had been found at last. In recognition of Mortarion's struggle and potential, the Emperor bestowed upon him the command of the 14th Legion, once known as the Dusk Raiders. In reverence to their new primarch, the Legion took upon a new name, the Death Guard, adopting the color and tactic alongside the tendencies forged in the mist-covered crucible of Barbarous. But all was not right. Mortarion had dreamed of years for the moment he would lay Necare with his own hand. That final act of vengeance, his right, his closure, had been stained, and in its place, a debt to a distant godlike father was thrust upon him. Though he bent the knee, the seeds of resentment were buried deep within, and in the soul of Barbarous, such things do not simply wither and die. Excerpt from Mortarion's address to his legion. The war for Barbarous was over, but not without consequence. Mortarion, liberator, warlord, and now son reclaimed, fulfilled his oath to the Emperor with solemn fealty. Once sufficiently recovered from his near-fatal state, due to his ascent to the poisonous heights of his homeworld, he bent the knee before a being who claimed both his blood and his destiny. But not all wounds fade with time. The physical toll taken during his final confrontation and the psychological weight of having his vengeance denied would leave permanent marks on Mortarion, which were both deep and enduringly agitated. These scars, both visible and unseen, would never truly heal. Despite this, his role in the Emperor's grand design would be swiftly set in motion. Mortarion had already proven himself a master of warfare and doctrine. He was immediately granted command of the 14th Legion, his sons, by both Geneseed and Fate. They had once borne the name Dusk Raiders, a proud Terran force known for their methodical and tenacious fighting style. But what they beheld was now something wholly different. To those Terran-born warriors, their new warlord must have appeared like a specter from old Earth, a myth given form, gaunt, shrouded in ash-gray robes, a black scythe slung across his back, the very same weapon once wielded by the overlord who had raised him. All in all, he was a living silhouette of death itself, not unlike the Reaper of legends from ancient Terra. Mortarion's first words to them were stark and absolute, as he delivered in a reaping whisper, each syllable somehow cut through the silence like iron on stone, carried with an unnatural clarity to every corner of those assembled legionaries.
You are my unbroken blades. You are the death guard. By your hand shall justice be delivered, and doom shall stalk 1,000 worlds.
With those words, a transformation took place. The Dusk Raiders were officially no more. From that moment forward, the Legion carried a new name, a new moniker, and a new banner. A name steeped with the legacy of survival, endurance, and retribution. The title, Death Guard, was etched above the airlock of their flagship immediately. The Reaper's scythe was a symbol and a vessel that would soon become infamous across the galaxy. And with the strike of a single sentence, their old identity, their old honor, their old self had been buried deep. From then on, all records, all campaigns, and all honors earned and glories won would belong not to the Terran-born Dusk Raiders, but to the Death Guard, a legion reborn in sorrow, forged in defiance, and bound to a master who carried both burden and bitterness in equal measures. In the wake of Mortarion's ascension to command, the 14th Legion, once proud and relentless, began to shift, subtly at first, but then profoundly. Initially comprised almost entirely of Terran-born Astartes, the Legion underwent a radical transformation, following the integration of Barbarous into the Imperium. With Mortarion's firm hand guiding recruitment, new initiates were drawn almost exclusively from the harsh, toxin-choked world that had shaped the Primarch. Amongst the first and most notable of these new warriors was Callus Typhon, a grim and ambitious survivor of Barbarous, who had long served Mortarion as his chief lieutenant during the Liberation Wars and would now be elevated to the rank of first captain. Typhon's rise signaled more than just a simple appointment. It marked the beginning of a cultural divergence within the Legion. The infusion of Barbarous-born neophyte recruits hardened by a lifetime beneath the shadows of necromantic tyrants introduced new beliefs, customs, and a morbid pragmatism alien to their Terran-born brothers. Over time, the traditions of the old Dusk Raiders, steeped in Terran military doctrine and disciplined ritual, began to erode. In their place grew a new warrior culture, one shaped by Mortarion's ascetic philosophy, his disdain for weakness, and grim fatalism, which had been gained in a world ruled by death. By the closing years of the Great Crusade, this divide had deepened into a quiet schism. Tensions simmered beneath the surface as ideological fault lines separated the Terran veterans from the barbarous-born Astartes. The former clung to the Legion's old roots on Earth, while the latter stood resolutely behind their primarch and the vision he imposed. Tensions would eventually come to a head in the shadow of betrayal. On the eve of the Horus Heresy, Mortarion was forced to confront a bitter truth. Not all of his legion would follow him into rebellion. As the orders were drawn for the purge of Isstvan III, it became evident that nearly 1/3 of the Death Guard were deemed as potentially disloyal. Astartes, whose allegiance to the Emperor outweighed even their loyalty to Mortarion. Amongst them were many of Terran origin, warriors who had once been the Dusk Raiders and still bore the values of that era. The most prominent of these deserters was Battle Captain Nathaniel Garrow of the 7th Company. Garrow, a relic of his legion's pre-barbarous identity, remained fiercely loyal to the Emperor and his vision of unity. His conscience and his honor would not allow him to follow his Genesire into treachery. What followed was not merely a military purge, it was a breaking of a brotherhood. What you like about the 14th Legion: they are mean, ugly bastards, but tenacious. There's no one else I'd rather have at my side in a war of attrition, and almost anyone else I'd rather have against me. Excerpt from Ferrus Manus, Primarch of the Iron Hands, following the compliance of 1544. In the long bloody decades which followed Mortarion's formal unification with his legion, the newly christened Death Guard became one of the most feared and efficient instruments of Imperial compliance. Their crusades were tireless, unyielding, and unending. The 14th Legion did not pause, they did not entrench, and they did not linger. Their fleet carved a path through the void like a rusted blade drawn across taut flesh, halting only long enough to resupply before plunging once more into battle. Their methods were grim, yet direct. In their campaigns, there would be no monuments raised, no fortresses built, no cities left behind as symbols of Imperial might. Where the Death Guard went, they cleansed. They did not inspire, but rather they went to annihilate resistance in its totality. They were not builders of empires. Instead, they were executioners. Under Mortarion's leadership, the Legion's doctrine hardened further still into something unrelenting, as the man himself was. His philosophy, shaped by the poisonous mists of Barbarous and the tyranny he had overthrown, took root deep within his son's very soul. It grew and grew into a doctrine of utter resistance and grim necessity. Wherever hardship was to be endured, and every act, no matter how brutal, it was seen as justified in the name of liberation. The Death Guard came to believe that true freedom for mankind could only be achieved by the complete eradication of those who threatened its continued survival. Mortarion's war was not one for glory or even conquest. It was one of extermination in the name of salvation. No mercy was to be granted, no quarter given. His was to be a war, fought without limit and without pity. And so, system by system, the Death Guard advanced, each campaign more brutal than the last. They moved not as heroes, but as a slow, inevitable contagion, silent, corrosive, and total in its effect. As the Great Crusade would push out into the darkness, Mortarion's legion left behind no legacy of architecture, culture, or art. Instead, they were remembered in the hushed tones of the survivors of their conquests, in worlds left broken but utterly and totally compliant, and in records etched with both blood and smoke. One such example was the conquest of 1544. From the meticulous records of the Imperium's archives, the recounts of the conquest of 1544, an exodite world where the Death Guard had fought alongside the Iron Hands and the Salamanders. This campaign was waged under the banner of the 154th Expeditionary Fleet, and it was a veiled snare crafted by the Eldar to forewarn Primarch Ferrus Manus of his future betrayal by Fulgrim, alongside a prophecy of what would unfold at Isstvan V. Herein, I will focus on the often overlooked yet steadfast contribution of this conflict from the Death Guard. As the Iron Hands were leading the assault, they found themselves ensnared by the Eldar's hit-and-run tactics and the swarming Chitin slaves. Their advance faltering as the Imperial army regiments succumbed to the harsh elements. The disaster deepened further still when Ferrus Manus was entrapped within a psychic labyrinth and subjected to visions of a monstrous purple serpent, while the Eldar sorcery manipulated the weather in order to disable the Iron Hand's cherished bionics. It was in this adverse environment that the Death Guard would become the Imperial forces' unyielding bulwark. Due to their renowned endurance, they would hold the line, repelling the Eldar's assaults from the main expeditionary fleet time and time again, shielding the faltering Imperium forces from total collapse. Though records do not detail their precise deeds, their presence ensured the campaign did not fully collapse in on itself. Meanwhile, the Salamanders under Primarch Vulcan encountered the primitive humans dwelling in harmony with the Exodite Eldars. These were descendants of captives freed from dark Eldar tyranny. Rejecting the Imperium, these tribes would meet their end when Vulcan, guided by a psychic echo of the Emperor, ordered the planet's complete and total cleansing, erasing the stain of human-Xenos coexistence from the galaxy. This action was greatly supported by the Death Guard, who had at this point become almost completely steeped in Mortarion's disdain for all things alien. Ultimately, Ferrus Manus would break free and due to how they had continuously attacked, spurned the Eldar's warnings, and with the aid of the Death Guard and the Salamanders, demolished their webway gate, completely isolating this sector of space from the Eldar's transportation systems. Back to the task at hand. When Mortarion assumed full control of the 14th Legion, he did so not as a father, embracing long-lost sons, but as a stern master laying claim to a grim inheritance. His authority was to be absolute, his demeanor distant, and yet his legion adored him, with the fervor of religious zealots. To the Astartes of the Death Guard, he was not merely a warlord, he was the embodiment of their creed, unyielding, incorruptible, and resolute. From the onset, Mortarion viewed the Legion as a continuation of the crusade he had begun on Barbarous. To that end, he imposed his own exacting standards. Under his direction, the Death Guard was reshaped into a force of peerless infantry honed to function with minimal reliance on external support. He emphasized reliable, easily maintained war gear and discouraged the dependence on complex or esoteric technology. Their weapons were designed to be rugged from the outset, their armor mostly unadorned, yet brutally effective. In the crucible of the endless wars he deemed to fight, he forged them into true masters of attrition, soldiers who chose their battlefields wisely, and then they would crush their enemies upon it like stone upon stone. He deemed them to become the anvil to their allies' hammer, or when requested, the bludgeon itself. Some brother Primarchs dismissed Mortarion's strategies as crude and uninspired. However, results spoke louder than refinement. The Death Guard's records of victory across battlefields through the breadth of the Great Crusade was undeniable, and it was a testament to Mortarion's genius for practical warfare and disciplined execution of stratagems. His tactics were not glamorous, but they endured like the men who carried them out. The transformation was not solely tactical, as Mortarion's gene seed, combined with the relentless regiments of toxic acclamation and environmental hazarding, made the Death Guard into some of the most hardy Astartes ever found. Something more than merely durable. They were nearly unbreakable. The Terran-born remnants of the Dusk Raiders evolved swiftly into this doctrine, becoming embodiments of the word endurance. As Mortarion recruited even more warriors from the hostile world of Barbarous, the Legion's resilience only grew. Their fearlessness led them to war zones where other legions hesitated to enter. Dead worlds, irradiated wastelands, chemical-choked battlefields, and as fitting of such warriors, they bore both Rad and Fox Vex weapons just as easily as they did bolters, and they even deployed forbidden viral agents with brutal efficiency. It wasn't long before their name carried a shadow of stigma amongst their peers, a dark reputation that Mortarion neither denied nor defended. His concerns lay not within the opinions of others, but with their mission, the destruction of all tyrants. His ideal of using one's strength as a shield for the helpless lay at the heart of Mortarion's vision. But over time, the Death Guard's admiration for their own endurance curdled into contempt. They began to see those who they protected as weak and increasingly unworthy of their sacrifice. The line between saviors and oppressors grew thin. In the eyes of the Imperium, their triumph remained largely unsung, as Mortarion found greater kinship in Horus than the Emperor himself. believing the War Master appreciated his value in ways that the Emperor never had. It was a sentiment that festered over time, quiet and corrosive, and unfortunately unheeded by those who might have changed its course. The aftermath of this relentless warfare across the stars was a transformation which took hold within the ranks of the 14th, one far deeper than the accumulation of battle honors or the wear of campaign scars. Over the decades, the very soul of the Death Guard shifted. What had once been a force of elite, proud Terran warriors, the storied Dusk Raiders of Old Earth, was now being reforged into a bleak, corrosive mold, indicative of Mortarion's very own homeworld, Barbarous. Gone were the ornate traditions of the Officio Militaris and the once symbolic heraldry of Terra, with its structured martial hierarchies and historical reverence. All that was stripped away. The influence of Terra would continue to dwindle until it was scarcely even visible. In its place, a new grim doctrine would emerge, one born not of ceremony or pride, but of hardship and survival. The Legion's warplate would reflect this shift. The bare ivory ceramite favored by Mortarion grew more austere over time, further minimizing ornamentation, and in place of livery and lineage, the armor bore a muted, murky jade, a stark echo of the swamp mud that had once protected the mortal rebels on Barbarous from the toxins and foes they faced during their rebellion. These markings weren't of honor, but rather utility, and function in Mortarion's vision would always triumph over flourish. Eventually, this evolution reached into the foundational structures of the Legion itself. The Librarius, once a standard pillar amongst the legions, was similarly disbanded, as Mortarion's visceral disdain for Psykers influenced his legion further still. Said Psykers, whom he associated with the nightmarish necromancers of his youth, and these memories left no room for what he deemed as witchery. The sanctioned use of Psykers was, in his mind, a betrayal of the hard-earned discipline and a creeping horror not unlike the overlords he had once slain. Mortarion's hand would then touch every aspect of his legion, as he altered their tactical doctrine, scrutinizing procurement chains to the point that he intervened almost obsessively in the practices of the apothecarian, where multiple whispers and records persist that he influenced the very criteria for the recruitment and transformation. Such interference was not done of idle curiosity, but rather it was a part of a broader project to ensure the Death Guard no longer resembled the force that he had inherited, but rather an instrument he envisioned. Meanwhile, the fate of Barbarous itself became a matter of grim speculation, as the planet's dense fog and death-laced swamps remained a fertile breeding ground for horrors long thought vanquished. Some within the Imperium quietly argued that its remaining human population should have been relocated or eradicated altogether for the safety of future generations, but Mortarion refused, as Barbarous to him was sacred, as it had been purchased with agony and bought with bitter sacrifice, and now belonged to those strong enough to endure it. Indeed, the children of that world, and at the time, were the preferred candidates for ascension. Many underwent the dangerous and often lethal process of late Astartes' introduction, their mortality deemed a worthy price for the elevation of a legion with significantly more experienced combatants, as it seemed Mortarion preferred his stock of Astartes to be taken from an older lot, despite the risk. Others, the mortal warriors who had also once bled beside Mortarion in his revolution against the Carrion lords, would rise to power, becoming a new ruling class on the world, referred to as a dread aristocracy. Seated atop the poisoned soil they had once fought to reclaim, they would gain a great amount of influence within the Imperium, so long as Mortarion remained loyal and in power. What had emerged was not just a legion, but a legacy and a culture of reliance and ruthlessness, fused with the iron-hard philosophy of the primarch, who believed that strength was its own justification and weakness in any form was a sin that could not be forgiven. As the Great Crusade pressed deeper and deeper still into the darkest spaces of the galaxy, the 14th Legion, once marked by a diversity of origin and Terran discipline, underwent a transformation both visible and insidious. The source of this change was, well, Mortarion's preferred recruitment practices. With time and momentum, barbarous Mortarion's toxin-ridden homeworld ceased to simply be a symbol or a staging ground. It became something else entirely, a biological foundry, a harsh forging ground designed to breed a new type of Astartes. Other recruitment worlds assigned to the Death Guard under Imperial edict fell increasingly silent, providing only token numbers explicitly when the Legion's losses in the field grew too dire to ignore. Mortarion, obsessively and ever reliant on his own resilience, considered all those from outside barbarous to be lesser stock, and he showed a reluctance to draw from anywhere other than his homeworld. It would only be the demands of attrition that tempered his stance. Yet his preference was more than a statement, as barbarous produced warriors of a rare constitution. Its nearly feral inhabitants, raised in the swamps and poison-choked valleys of a world that had chewed through generations of human weakness, proved highly compatible with the rigorous and often lethal late implantation of Legion's Astartes organs. When paired with Mortarion's own rather resilient gene seed, these recruits displayed an unprecedented resilience to contagions, toxins, and environmental extremes. In effect, they were born into the war their primarch envisioned and bred to endure it since before his very existence. But this influx brought in a brutal cultural shift. As waves of barbarous-born neophytes joined the Legion, their older Terran core, the veterans of the Dusk Raiders, dwindled in numbers. Though still respected for their battlefield prowess and unbroken will, they now stood apart, a proud minority fiercely loyal to the ideals of the Emperor's early crusade, and they would become increasingly isolated within their own legion. By the closing decades of the Great Crusade, as the 31st millennium loomed and civil war brewed in the shadows of humanity's dauntless armies, these cultural divisions only deepened further still, as a rift grew, not of strategy or doctrine, but of identity. The Terran-born Death Guard remembered the disciplined brotherhood of old Earth. In contrast, the sons of Barbarous answered only to Mortarion's new order, and were forged in his image of honed hardship. This fault line would soon crack open entirely in the tense days before the drop site massacre at Isstvan III, where Mortarion made a chilling judgment. He believed that as much as 1/3 of his legion, primarily composed of those Terran-born who had not been shaped by Barbarous, would refuse to turn against the Emperor, and his assumption was made rightfully, as amongst these loyalists was the legendary Captain Nathaniel Garrow of the 7th Company, a Terran-born Dusk Raider to the core. His loyalty was to the Emperor, and it ran deeper than blood, deeper than even the reverence he genetically owed to his primarch. In that moment, Garrow and others like him became a threat, not just to the Legion, but to the destiny Mortarion had already set in motion. In the strategic theater of the Great Crusade, Mortarion and his legion, the Death Guard, were seen not simply as warriors, but as a weapon of endurance and attrition. Horus Lupercal, ever the consummate tactician and the architect of combined arms warfare between Imperial legions, recognized the potential of Mortarion's methods, as he employed them with surgical precision. Together, their coordination became a recurring pattern on the battlefield. The Death Guard would grind down an enemy through unrelenting pressure, absorbing the worst the foe could offer, and then, when resilience began to falter, the Luna Wolves would strike with an overwhelming fresh force. It was a system that worked both brutally and consistently with a terrifying efficiency. Through these protracted campaigns, Mortarion would grow closer to Horus, the Primarch of the Death Guard, a pallid and imposing figure forever clad in his breathing apparatus and bearing his gargantuan scythe known as Silence, remained isolated from most of his kin. Many of his fellow Primarchs viewed him as a grotesque relic of Death's cold reach, rather than a brother who desired unity. Only Conrad Kurz, the Night Haunter, and Horus himself seemed to truly understand Mortarion. With Horus, Mortarion found a rare kinship. So deep was the bond that whispers began to circulate within certain circles of the Imperial court that Mortarion's true allegiance lay not within the Emperor, but with the War Master. The Emperor, perhaps blinded by ambition or trust, dismissed such concerns. His infamous declaration that loyalty to Horus was functionally equivalent to loyalty to the throne would in hindsight become a gargantuan and tragic miscalculation. When Horus made his fateful turn towards chaos, the trap had already been sprung, and Mortarion's fall would neither be slow nor truly reluctant. He did not require much convincing to align with Horus, as his allegiance to him had long eclipsed any genuine devotion to the Emperor or his cause. Moreover, the traitorous first captain, Callus Typhon, had long since given himself over to the ruinous powers. Along with this, his influence within the upper echelons of the Death Guard had become both pervasive and corrosive, as Typhon, ever the manipulator, apostate, and herald of corruption, played a decisive role in steering the Legion towards perpetual damnation. And the moment where Mortarion's loyalty would become laid bare was during the scouring of Isstvan III. Knowing that many within his rank, especially the Terran-born veterans, remained exclusively loyal to the Emperor, Mortarion willingly cast aside nearly a third of his legion into the furnace of betrayal. In 005 M31, the planetary governor of Isstvan III, Vardus Paral, corrupted by the chaos god Slanesh, declared independence from the Imperium. His forbidden sorcery had taken root within the Coral City, prompting the Council of Terra to charge the War Master Horus with restoring the world to Imperial compliance. Yet Horus had secretly pledged himself to chaos, exploiting the mandate to purge loyalist elements within his legion, the Sons of Horus, alongside the World Eaters, the Death Guard, and the Emperor's children. Amongst the Death Guard, approximately 1/3 were in fact confirmed to be unswayable to chaos. Under the pretense of quelling rebellion, said third would be deployed alongside the loyalists from the other legions. As they would engage the Slaneshi cultists, Horus would unleash a devastating series of virus bombs, intending to annihilate all life within the planet, including those of the Astartes en masse. And quickly upon this action, the Life Eater virus ravaged the Coral City, reducing its inhabitants to decayed husks before the biological firestorm incinerated its remnants. Yet, despite this, some loyalists survived, sheltered from the viral onslaught. Enraged by this failure, Primarch Angron of the World Eaters led 50 companies of his traitorous sons in a reckless assault on the planet. Horus, compelled to reinforce Angron's impulsive attack, committed traitor forces from the Death Guard, the Sons of Horus, and the Emperor's children to aiding the World Eaters. The Death Guard, under Mortarion's grim command, descended upon the toxic ash-laden ruins of the world, and due to their renowned resilience, they excelled beyond almost any other traitors within these conditions, pressing their assault against their former brothers. For 3 months, the Loyalists, led by Captain Sol Tarvitz, Gavriel Loken, and Tariq Targaradon, resisted valiantly, delaying Horus's plans significantly. Yet the Death Guard's unyielding advance, bolstered by their endurance, in particular within poisonous battlefields, proved instrumental in crushing the Loyalists' defenses. Amidst this slaughter, the loyal Death Guard captain, Nathaniel Garo, would become a symbol of hope, eventually commandeering the frigate known as the Eisenstein. He escaped Isstvan III, bearing news of Horus's treachery to Terra. This was a pivotal act that would reverberate throughout the eternity, throughout the records of the Horus Heresy. In the end, Horus would order a final orbital bombardment, reducing the Coral City to ash and dust, silencing the last loyalist holdouts. Thus, the Isstvan III atrocity became a testament to the Death Guard's tragic schism, a legion divided, with traitors forging their own path to damnation, while loyalists like Garo clung to the Emperor's light amidst the storm of betrayal. What remained of the Death Guard under Mortarion emerged from the Purge reforged, now wholly allied to Horus's cause. From here they marched into the blackest chapter of Imperial history, with the same grim tidings as ever, as during the Dropsite Massacre, the Death Guard burned the final bridge they had left to the Imperium, as they stood shoulder to shoulder with the now traitorous legions, breaking with the loyalists in a wholly methodical and merciless way. And when word reached Terra of Horus's unspeakable atrocity, the Emperor in his divine wrath unleashed 7 legions of his Space Marines to bring the renegade War Master and the other Primarchs to heel. The first wave would comprise the nigh unbreakable Iron Hands, the noble Salamanders, and the swift and implacable Raven Guard, as they would descend on Isstvan V like avenging angels, their hearts set ablaze with loyalty to the throne. Yet Horus's soul, blackened by chaos, had woven a trap of such traitorous, diabolical cunning that it would drown the galaxy in blood. After the Loyalists' initial landing, from the shadows would emerge the Death Guard, once the stalwart defenders of mankind and the bulwark of the Imperium, now these twisted harbingers of ruin under the command of the traitorous primarch Mortarion, would attack. With a zeal born of corruption, they struck at the salamanders directly, as they were to be their principal prey in this storm of treachery. Concealed in trenches and fortified layers, they unleashed a maelstrom of surprise assaults. Mines tore through the earth, alchemical weapons poisoned the air with their death-choking embrace, and relentless volleys of heavy fire blasted the Loyalists. The ground itself groaned beneath the weight of their assault, as the Death Guard's toxic wrath sought to snuff out the Emperor's light. Yet the salamanders, tempered by the fires and the harsh environment of Nocturne, stood as titans against the tide of darkness. Led by the nigh immortal Primarch Vulcan, they met the Death Guard's savagery with a resolve that shook the heavens. Bolters roared with the fury of 1,000 suns, and chainswords clashed in a symphony of wrath, defiance, and betrayal, as the battle became a forging ground of valor, where the loyal sons of the Emperor fought not only for the survival of their own kin, but that of the Imperium as a whole. As the Loyalists bled upon the anvil of war, the second wave of their supposed allies arrived, only to reveal the ever-darkening abyss of treachery, as the Iron Warriors, the Alpha Legion, the Wordbearers, and the Night Lords had, unbeknownst to the Loyalists, sworn their loyalty to Horus's cause, and they quickly turned their guns upon their brothers in a crossfire of unimaginable consequence. The trap was now complete, and the Loyalists were surrounded and faced annihilation at the hands of those they once called kin, as the air screamed with anguish of a galaxy betrayed, and the stars themselves seemed to dim evermore in shame. Amidst the slaughter, a tragedy of cosmic proportions would unfold. Fulgrim, the fallen Phoenician, confronted his brother Ferrus Manus, the Gorgon of the Iron Hands, in a duel that would rend the fabric of fraternity forevermore amongst the Primarchs. Once the closest of allies, they clashed with the fury of gods, until Fulgrim, urged by the whisperings of malice from the Lair Blade, struck his brother with a mortal blow. A single, profane assault would behead Ferrus Manus, casting his noble head to the dust and shattering the Loyalist spirits. This was no act of mere murder, but it was the first carrion call of chaos echoing across the void, showing that the Primarchs were indeed mortal men. Even as doom closed in, the Loyalists burned with the Emperor's unyielding light, as the salamanders would hold strong despite their charred and burned flesh, which had been unceremoniously gifted to them by the chemical horrors of the Death Guard. In the end, the Loyalist legions deployed here were broken. The Iron Hands, the Salamanders, and the Raven Guard were nearly annihilated, their once proud ranks reduced to a scant few hundred survivors, who fled into the void, wounded, weary, and bearing the scars of betrayal, as they could do little more to stem the tide of Horus's forces other than hit and run attacks to bleed their supply lines. As it seems, the Death Guard's merciless assault did indeed reap a grim harvest, as they were able to almost completely overwhelm and overpower the Salamanders. Eventually, the next major incident of galactic import that would involve the Death Guard would come about in the Second Battle of Prospero, which was fought in 007 M31 during the early stages of the Horus Heresy, and it marked a crucial juncture for both the traitors and the Loyalists, in particular revolving Jagatai Khan, the Primarch of the White Scars. As he sought clarity, this was due to the fragmented lines of information. What followed would be a saga of betrayal, survival, and what would amount to a multi-year relentless pursuit by the Death Guard, along with multiple clashes over ancient technology. After declining to assist Leman Russ and the battered Spacewolf fleet against the Alpha Legion in the Alexis Nebula, Jagatai Khan turned his attention to Prospero proper, the homeworld of the Thousand Suns. Drawn in by a need for answers amidst the burgeoning civil war, he arrived with his fleet in orbit and teleported directly to the surface with a select contingent of his Kirshig honor guard, elite warriors clad in ornate Terminator armor, wielding power glaives and bolters forged on Chagoris. His destination was Tizca, the once gleaming city of psychic wonders, now a desolate ruin scarred by the burning of Prospero. As Jagatai traversed the shattered streets and ravaged wastelands, wastes, the wind carried the ash and echoes of lost grandeur. His warriors scouted the perimeter, but the primarch, driven by instincts, ventured into a labyrinthian subterranean cavern system deep beneath the city. These tunnels, carved from some of the most beautiful obsidian known to man and lined with faintly glowing runes, pulsed with the residual psychic energy of the Thousand Suns' fallen legacy. Deep within the caverns, Jagatai encountered an ethereal projection of his brother, Magnus the Red, the Crimson King. His form now shimmered as a spectral giant, raised in crimson and gold, his single eye blazing with sorrow and rage. As Magnus spoke in resonant tones, his voice reverberated off the stone walls, imploring Jagatai to choose a side within the escalating heresy. The Emperor is a tyrant cloaked in light, Magnus warned, recounting his own betrayal during the burning of Prospero. He urged Jagatai to forsake his father and join the War Master Horus Lupercal, promising enlightenment and freedom from Terra's shackles. Jagatai listened, his hawk-like gaze unwavering, but his heart remained guarded. He questioned Magnus's motives, probing the projection for truth amidst the venomous rhetoric. Ultimately, he found the answers he sought, not in an alliance with Horus, but in a reaffirmed loyalty to the Emperor, tempered by the resolve to uncover the full scope of the conflict. With a curt nod, he turned from the fading image of his brother in order to rejoin his Kershig. As Jagatai emerged into the ashen daylight, his reunion with his honor guard was short-lived, as from the ruins came Mortarion, primarch of the Death Guard, flanked by his death shroud terminators, silent hulking figures shrouded in tattered cloaks, wielding man-reapers, scythes which were dripping in alchemical toxins, which the universe nary had a cure for. Mortarion's presence now was a miasma of decay as his rebreather hissed with each labored breath. His gaunt frame towered over the white scars. Mortarion's voice was now a guttural rasp as it carried his offer. Join Horus, embrace the War Master's vision, claim vengeance against the Emperor who had forsaken them all, and aid him in eliminating all the witches from existence, including those within the ranks of the traitors. Jagatai's refusal was swift and unshaking. His words were sharp, as he would state, "I ride my own path, not yours." Mortarion lunged, his scythe arcing towards his brother. The duel that would ensue was a clash of opposites, Jagatai's speed and precision against Mortarion's relentless endurance. The White Scar's Primarch danced around his foe, his bladed dao flashing like lightning, carving deep rents into Mortarion's baroque armor. The Death Shroud moved to intervene, but the Kashig themselves met the traitors with equal ferocity. Bolter fire and glaive strikes felling several of the elite guard. As the fight would go on, Jagatai would attempt to convince Mortarion of the folly of his ways. However, Mortarion would reply, "My legion was at his fan, so put aside any thoughts that we are not committed. The outcome is already determined, and your choice is simple: preservation or destruction. Come, Jagatai, you've never believed in unity. You saw through it even when Guilliman was lecturing us all to tears, back when there were still Xenos standing between our father and the galaxy's edge. Then tell me the alternative. A galaxy of warriors," Mortarion said. "A galaxy of hunters, where the strong are given their freedom. A galaxy in which there is no dead hand at the tiller, constraining us, lying to us." And all this led by Horus. Mortarion shrugged. "He's the start. He's the champion, the sacrificial king. He may burn himself out to get to Terra. He may not. Either way, there will be room for others to rise." Mortarion drew closer, and the Khan smelt the chemical tang of his armor. "You should have never thrown your lot in with the angel, brother, let alone Magnus. I hated to see it. The three of you getting dragged in deeper. I always thought you'd break away, see through it, get tired of the hypocrisy. They were never hypocrites. No?" Mortarion exhaled a parched laugh. "I hoped you'd understood them sooner. It's the warp, Jagatai. Our father tried to pretend it wasn't there, as if he wasn't already up to his elbows in soul-sucking filth. It should have been cordoned off, put away, forgotten about. It's not for us. It's a sickness, a blight." Mortarion had become agitated. He then calmed down, slowly wheezing through the gas-shrouded mask. The Khan heard a faint hiss, and he guessed what kind of suppressants had been shunted into his bloodstream. I see what has happened, he said quietly. Oh, Mortarion crooked his head. Oh, you were always sincere, I'll give you that, said the Khan. You never hid what you wanted. I can guess how you thought it would go. First, hobble the sorcerers, silence the witches, drive them out, and rule passes to the uncorrupted. Be healthy. That was your great project. You even told me of it that day on Ulnor. I thought back then that they were empty threats, but I should have known. You make no empty threats. As the Khan spoke, Mortarion's mask-locked expression remained inscrutable. Every so often his eyes would go firmly or his fingers would twitch. There was this kind of febrile energy around him, spilling out of the same cracks as the noxious fumes did. But it has gone wrong, hasn't it? The Khan went on. You have completed your great mission, but there's more sorcerers than ever now. Horus sponsored them. Lorgar has shown them new tricks. If Magnus has not already made up his mind, then he soon will. And then you will be surrounded. You destroyed the Librarius, only to find the witches are now unleashed. They played you well. You have done their work for them. And soon you'll be dragged into it yourself, as warp sick as they are. You think that. I see it perfectly. Magnus showed me. Your legion may be free of it for now, but the change will come. You've made your pacts, and now they will come to collect, you fool. Mortarion stifled. His eyes blazed with anger for a second, quickly quelled. You do not, and that is why you come to find me. You've run out of friends. Who still stands with you against the Aether Weavers now? Angron, what an ally. Kurz, good luck. The Khan glazed at Mortarion disdainfully. You've tasted the fruits of treachery and found them bitter. Don't drag me into your ruin. You're on your own, brother. At this, Mortarion's expression fractured behind his mask, shifting into an enraged snarl, and disfigured further still, rapidly, as silence quivered and their battle continued. At the end of this first confrontation, Jagatai's blade struck through, piercing Mortarion's side and forcing the Death Guard Primarch to stagger back, his demigod ichor spilling from his wound. With a snarled curse, Mortarion signaled retreat, his forces vanishing into a haze as his teleport beacons fired off. Victorious but wary, Jagatai was forced to teleport back to his flagship, the Sword Storm, and he ordered the White Scars fleet to set course for Terra, determined to stand against the growing tide of treason. The White Scars' journey to Terra would then be thwarted by the Ruin Storm, a colossal warp storm conjured by the traitorous sorcery of the Word Bearers, which severed the reliable navigational routes across the galaxy. Stranded far from the throne world, Jagatai's fleet became a constant target for the Death Guard, now fully committed to Horus's cause and with no way out. Under Mortarion's command, the Death Guard would pursue the White Scars methodically and cruelly. Their plague-ridden vessels emerged from the warp to strike without warning. Outnumbered and unable to warp jump safely, the White Scars adopted a hit-and-run guerrilla campaign of engagements. Jagatai leveraged his son's unmatched mobility, striking the traitor supply lines and outposts before vanishing into the void. Each engagement was a testament to their skill at lightning raids by bike-mounted warriors, boarding actions led by veterans, and ambushes orchestrated from the shadows of asteroid fields. Yet the cost was steep, as for over 4 years, nearly 1/5 of the Legion, thousands of battle brothers, fell to the Death Guard's toxic weaponry and unyielding assaults. By 011 M31, the Death Guard would be officially joined by a substantial cadre of Emperor's children, led by the flamboyant and foppish Lord Commander Eidolon. Clad in garish armor and wielding sonic weaponry, Eidolon's warriors complemented the Death Guard's attrition tactics with relentless and rather quick-footed aggression. Together, they adapted to the White Scars' strategies, quickly, tightening the noose around Jagatai's forces. Void battles from here would grow increasingly one-sided, with traitor ships outmaneuvering and outgunning the Loyalists, their crews reveling in the carnage. Jagatai recognized the peril. His legion, once a storm of unmitigated, unceasing blades, was being whittled down to a flicker. A final stand now loomed unless he was able to escape. In a desperate bid for survival, the White Scars scouted the Callous Warp Rift, a turbulent region of space rumored to conceal ancient secrets. Amidst this jagged, warp anomalous area, they discovered a hidden navigator facility, its spires surrounded in psychic mist. Within lay the Dark Glass, a prototype of the Emperor's Golden Throne. This was a crystalline device, pulsing with arcane energy, capable of piercing into the webway, the labyrinthian dimension beyond the warp, used by the Eldar. However, the artifact demanded a steep price, which would be paid in full, as Targutai Yagasai, a venerable Stormseer and one of Jagatai's closest advisors, volunteered to be the sacrifice to activate it, his hair white and streaked with silver as he sat upon the throne, his mind linking with the machinery fully as he channeled the entirety of his psychic might, allowing the device to flare to life, tearing open a temporary portal into the webway. The effort consumed him, his body withered to ash and dust as the rift stabilized, but the sacrifice had allowed the White Scar's fleet to escape, emerging on the edge of Segmentum Solar, just within striking distance of Terra, and completely going around the traitorous defensive lines. In 008 M31, another rather notable engagement had occurred within the Perditus system. This was the Battle of the Tchula engine, an ancient semi-sentient device capable of creating precise warp jumps regardless of a map or a beacon, along with the Ouroboros, a third unnamed engine, with the capability of creating multiple stable temporal rifts. Both of these relics were up for grabs. The Iron Hands 98th Clan Company, led by Castellir Lormac, clashed with the Death Guard's contingent under the control of First Captain Typhon. For a moment, the two forces waged a brutal war across the Perditus system, their Mechanicum and Dark Mechanicus allies deploying automata along with siege engines in the bid to claim the dual prizes. The Tchula was a spherical construct of Xenos origin, whispered about in mechanical tone, the surface of which was etched with ever-shifting glyphs. Both sides coveted this technology's power. Lormark to avenge the Iron Hands' loss at Isan, and Typhon to deliver it to Horus and Mortarion. However, during this conflict, an astropathic message would reach the Dark Angels, prompting Lionel Johnson to intervene. His fleet, a vast armada of black-hulled warships, descended upon Perditus, dwarfing both previous combatants' fleets by a wide margin. The Lion's cold voice was now commanding as a bookered no defiant. Both forces were ordered to withdraw. Lormic complied reluctantly, his ironclad discipline and loyalty to the Imperium firm, while Typhon retreated with a sneer, his ambitions thwarted by the greater military power he had faced. Wary of Typhon's sinister intent and rumors of his growing ties to the Warp's dark powers, the Lion seized the Tchula engine without further communications, as he saw the power as a potential asset and a tool to outmaneuver the traitors. In a final act of pragmatism, he ordered the complete and total annihilation of Perditus through the use of what seems to be the Lion's favorite tactic, orbital bombardments, in order to keep both Lormec and Typhon from gaining any information about the artifact's design, use, or power, causing Typhon and his Death Guard contingent to rage at its loss. As the final phases of the Horus Heresy loomed upon the horizon, Mortarion's orders were clear. The Death Guard would join the vanguard of the invasion on Terra. The Legion, once known for its cold discipline and ruthless endurance, having at least partly been drawn from Terra's noble heritage, was now so committed to the traitor's cause that they would destroy their origin point. Yet it was not steel or fire that would bring the Death Guard low. It was betrayal from within. First Captain Kalas Typhon, Mortarion's most trusted and long-lived commander, a towering figure within the very Legion's hierarchy, had apparently long harbored secrets that would damn the Legion as a whole. However, it was not on Barbarous, nor even amongst the legions of the War Master, that Typhon's true path was forged. Instead, it was when fighting alongside the Wordbearer's Legion that his fate and that of the entire Death Guard was sealed. There, under the influence of the insidious Chaplain Erebus, Typhon was introduced to the Seven-Pillared Lodge, one of the countless warrior lodges rooted in the beliefs of the primitive tribes of Davin that had been spread out and set up amongst many of the legions. What began as philosophical curiosity soon became a conduit for heresy, as within the shadowed rituals, Typhon learned of a new future for the Legion Astartes, one where the psychic gifts he had long concealed from his master would not be a shameful burden, but a source of power and glory. The teaching whispered within the lodge showed him a vision of what the Astartes could become if only they would abandon the yoke of the Emperor's ambition and the illusion of unity. This revelation, if such it was, may have been the primary catalyst for Mortarion's eventual fall, or perhaps it was merely another drop of poison that pushed a reluctant soul fully into the abyss. Whether Mortarion's cause was shaped by Typhon or his own bitterness remains one open to debate. What is known, however, is that the Lord of Death saw in Horus a master worthy of fealty, while the Emperor in Mortarion's eyes remained a distant tyrant who had usurped the hard-fought sovereignty Mortarion had won on Barbarous in a single humiliating day. And so the order was given. The Death Guard's fleet was made ready to breach the veil of reality and descend upon Terra itself, but they would never arrive as such. Without warning, the fleet would become lost in the Imperium, caught adrift in a hellscape of madness and decay, and the cause itself was Typhon. The first captain had quietly executed every navigator aboard the fleet, accusing them of treason and collusion with Malcador the Sigillite. With that bridge to reality severed, he offered himself as their replacement, claiming that his burgeoning psychic powers would offer sufficient power to guide them through the storm. However, this was not a promise, it was a sentence. What followed was not a voyage, but rather a descent, as the Death Guard were trapped in a rotting, unending nightmare, adrift in the Imperium, prey whose forces none of them fully understood. The suffering would be total, as their flesh began to rebel, their bodies bloated and twisted, as diseases spread faster than time could mark. The once proud sons of Mortarion, famed for their resilience, would find themselves utterly broken by afflictions no medicine could treat and no discipline could resist, and it would all culminate in a fleeting moment where Mortarion would attempt to sacrifice himself in order to save his sons by pledging himself to a greater power. Swear your loyalty to me. Bowed down upon one knee, Mortarion could not hold his gaze towards the black, blasted mud of Barbarous, and he looked up into the shining eye of the newcomer. The stranger's words seemed to stop the passage of time. An aura of power, vast and barely contained, crackled about him. He looked into Mortarion's eyes and saw into the murky depths of his soul, the lost and forgotten places within the Reaper of men, kept hidden even from himself. Mortarion's jaw stiffened. He did not want to be an open book. He did not want to give your fealty to the grandfather. Bowed upon one knee, Mortarion could not turn his gaze towards the rusted and broken steel of the Terminus X, and he looked up into the menacing eyes of the great entity that swallowed the sky. The God Thing's utterance made the strings of reality hum and resonate. A dark ether of corruption was falling like thick sleet, thickening the space around him. The entity that called itself the Grandfather filled Mortarion's lungs with spores of living death and opened him up from within, teasing apart sealed spaces to find the rich meat of unseen fears and his most secret hopes. Mortarion's fists clenched. He could feel his soul stripped bare. There was. You have chosen the only path you can, said his father, said his grandfather. You are my son. You are my champion. I have waited so very long for this day, for this day's dawning has long been awaited. Time and moment, past and present, these structures of them crumbled and turned into sand, smothering Mortarion in the elsewhen. He was there on Barbarous, and it was decades gone, and he was here in the utter insanity of the Imperium, together, separated, divided and merging. His father, the Emperor of Mankind, his patron, the Lord of the Decay, Nurgle, beckoned to him, offering Mortarion what he could not refuse. His oath, his honor forbade him from taking any other path in this moment forward. He had sworn to bend the knee to the stranger at the lodge if he could not defeat the High Overlord, and he had avowed to protect his gene sons and his legion beyond all else. Mortarion struggled frantically, trying to grasp the truth and lies, desperate to separate the ragged, deathly present from the echoing, ashen past. Which was reality, or were all things true? What price is an oath given in madness? He whispered the words. He howled them into the void. What do you want, my son? What do you want, my champion? The voices merged into a single tantric reverberation through his bones and his physical form, into the bounds of his turbulent, unquiet psyche. I want to endure. Then rise, rise, Mortarion. There is a brotherhood awaiting you out in the stars, the likes which you cannot comprehend, and with it a purpose that will illuminate the galaxy, a crusade upon which your name will be etched into eternity. Then rise, the grandfather told him. Rise, as a prince born of death. Vengeance awaits you in the realm of man, and with it the bleakest, most dire purpose, a slaughter by which your name will be feared until the last human soul fades into entropy. Mortarion said the vow without reservation. I give myself to your banner, my blood, my bone, the unbroken force of my will, and the power of my spirit. These are yours to command, if you grant me deliverance. His hand found the damaged, cracked blade of his war scythe and gripped it hard enough to cut metal and draw blood. He looked down and saw the transformation take hold of him. A force of immeasurable mutational power crashed through his physical form and overwhelmed the pitiful limits of flesh and blood. Mortarion tore away, rising to his feet, changing with each heartbeat. From his spine burst pestilent, insectile wings that quivered and crackled with new change. His soul soaked in the corrupting energy, dying and living, reborn and obliterated. The flesh across his gaunt features pulled tight, dragging his mouth into a riotous grin. The smile of death itself he would endure. Welcome home, said the voices. And so in one fell swoop, Mortarion and his legion would fall under the dominion of the chaos god of entropy and decay. One of the most harrowing chapters of the Death Guard's ever-tragic tale, their unrelenting and unyielding loyalty to Horus, and more darkly, their servitude to the forces beyond mortal understanding, led them to a fate which there would be no return from. That fate would see Mortarion and his warriors forever bound and corrupted. For all his disdain for witchery and his rejection of anything resembling the powers of sorcery, Mortarion would be forced and left with little recourse as his fleet, led by First Captain Callus Typhon, made a seemingly ill-fated transition into the warp. Typhon, in his manipulations and secretive dealings, had very well knowingly condemned the Death Guard to a fate of unimaginable torment and unending transformation. While Mortarion harbored no end of contempt for sorcery, he would soon learn that the tides of the imperium, those alien and malevolent creatures of the warp, were not easily navigated without the guiding hand of an infernal power. And so it was that Typhon steered the Death Guard fleet deeper and deeper still into the Imperium, to the point that their destiny was irrevocably altered. By leading the Death Guard into the warp, Typhon had deliberately delivered them into the grasps of the ruinous powers, and more specifically, into the ever-decaying embrace of Grandfather Nurgle, the Lord of Decay. Nurgle's influence was vast and all-consuming as it began to creep across the fleet. At first, it was subtle, a lingering miasma that gradually clouded their ship's atmospheres, but soon it became a force darker and more potent than anything they had yet encountered. It was therefore the fleet would become trapped in the warp with no hope of escape, directionless. The Death Guard warship languished in the eye of the unrelenting storm that was the Imperium. It was then that the true horrors of their experience would begin. The strange and volatile nature of the Imperium is notoriously known for distorting reality, but the Death Guard had unfortunately crossed into the domain of a god whose very essence was that of rot and decay. Nurgle's rot, a terrible, virulent plague, began to take a hold upon each and every last member of the Death Guard as it seeped through metal hulls and into their very being, poisoning not just the vessels that had once carried the Legion onto glory, but spreading deeper still into the warriors themselves, who were now helpless against this insidious disease. The Destroyer Plague was a manifestation of Nurgle's infectious wrath, and it found fertile ground within the very bones of the Death Guard. Soon, no part of this fleet was left untouched. Fat, twisted flies, strange otherworldly creatures, buzzed throughout the ship's corridors. Their incessant hum was a harbinger of coming destruction. Their venomous stings sank into the flesh of the Death Guard, and where they bit, flesh began to blister, bubble, and warp. Power armor, once a proud symbol of their transhuman strength, began to melt, morph, and distort into strange new forms, fusing with the infected warriors in grotesque, abominable displays. As the infection spread, the Death Guard could neither fight nor flee. Their transhuman resilience, which had served them well in countless battles, became an unending prison as their bodies refused to die, but instead they were forced to endure eternal, agonizing transformation. The warriors of the Death Guard, once the epitome of endurance and strength, now found themselves trapped in an unending, unrelenting cycle of corruption. As their bodies twisted and deformed, they were gradually transformed and metamorphosed into the very first Plague Marines. In the end, it was not an honorable death that would claim them, but a slow, relentless process of decay that consumed them from within, as each warrior's soul was claimed by Nurgle, who offered them a cruel form of mercy, an eternal release from pain and suffering in exchange for their total subjugation to the Lord of Decay. In the wake of this transformation, Typhon, who had been the architect of the Death Guard's inevitable ruin, was rewarded as his loyalty to Nurgle was now complete, and the former first captain, the once revered and trusted commander, the right hand of Mortarion, became the favored mortal servant of the Plague God, and his reward would be a twisted form of immortality. In the wake of the catastrophic descent into the warp, the Death Guard's suffering would only deepen, culminating in their horrifying transformation that would forever alter their legion and shape the future. And one of these changes would be Callous Typhon, becoming Typhus, host of the Destroyer Hive, some of the very warp-spawned demonic beasts that were the initial infection vector of the Death Guard. Now as Typhus, he would serve as a chilling testament to the horrors wrought by loyalty to the craven gods. Swelling in size, Typhon's skin and armor melded into a grotesque unified mass, as bone funnels, jagged and horrific, sprouted from his body, channeling the foul energies of Nurgle into a living, writhing conduit of corruption. Into these sickening channels did the demon flies make their home, as they gnawed at him from the inside out, feeding on his ever-decaying and regenerating flesh, functionally allowing Typhon's body to become little more than a hollow vessel teeming with these demonic insects, each buzzing with disease and decay granted to them by their masters. However, this transformation was not merely physical, it was spiritual as well, a complete subjugation of the Legion to the essence and will of Nurgle. The once proud first captain had been remade as Typhus, Lord of Chaos and the hosts of the Destroyer Hive, not a being of flesh, but rather a manifestation of pestilence and decay. His new form, a nightmarish mutation, a fusion of insect and man, his body now a breeding ground for disease, as his every movement was a call of death and suffering. His bone funnels did not only serve as homes for the hive, but as a conduit for the Destroyer Plague, one of the most virulent and terrifying diseases ever to ravage the galaxy. Although the plague's vector, the demon flies, would be the choke point of its spread, it was still devastating wherever it struck, and strike it did, leaving a trail of death and suffering across the Imperium. Typhus would go on to carry and use the Destroyer Plague as his personal weapon, unleashing upon the Imperium of Man a tally of destruction unending. But the true horror was not merely the birth of Typhus, but what this meant for the Death Guard. Mortarion, once a proud primarch of unmatched unending resilience and of an unbreakable will, was now faced with a cruel irony. His legion, built upon a foundation of their incredible endurance, found themselves powerless in the face of Nurgle's plague. Their bodies, once strong, were now rendered meaningless. The very strength that had defied them was now a pointless gesture. The pestilence would now surge through their ranks, infecting their superhuman forms, bloating them, disintegrating their flesh, and transforming them into pestilent grotesque. This was no simple disease, as it was an agonizing and ever-repeating process of corruption, decay, and rebirth. The Death Guard's warriors found themselves trapped within an endless cycle, unable to die, but forced to endure excruciating, unending agony, as the plagues roiled within them, twisting their bodies into unrecognizable and unholy abomination. Their once legendary resilience, so often their greatest strength, had become their greatest curse. The plague's effects ravaged them from the inside, each minute bringing a new flavor of suffering, as the Death Guard's warriors were faced with a fate worse than death itself, forced to watch their once proud forms disintegrate into repugnant, repulsive, and disgusting contorted shells of their former selves. No one suffered more in this transformation than Mortarion himself. His pride and his strength, once unshakable, were now made mockery by this very thing that he had sought to control, decay. Whether in the depths of his suffering, Mortarion realized the magnitude of the domination that he had brought upon himself and his legion by siding with the traitors. Whether he understood the consequences of his pact with Nurgle, only he would ever know. What is certain is in those final, harrowing, nightmarish moments, the Death Guard were forever changed. They were no longer the warriors they had once been. Rather, they were now agents of decay, a reflection of the destruction that they had brought upon themselves. The warp puckered beneath the surface of reality before detonating into existence. It was an ugly, catastrophic eruption that vomited raw madness and broken shards of tainted impossibility, opening into a festering wound on the face of space-time. The terror, in actuality, defied the pathetic rules of what was and what could be. Freakish things that could not live outside of nightmares became solid for brief moments, the sheer force of the breach willing them into existence. Around the rippling, shrieking edges of the terror, great coruscating tides of lethal radiation and charm-tainted particles storms the airless void into a blaze of soul-twisting pseudo-colors. And from their reclaimed prison, in the depths of the Imperium, the flotilla of the Death Guard Legion found their escape. Hundreds of rusting warhulks burst forth into the skies around the greatest bastion of the Emperor's Imperium, soiling the darkness with their very presence as the rays of faraway soul fell upon their blighted hulls. Daggers of corroding metal that had once been proud symbols of the 14th Legion poured out and wove amongst one another as carrion flies would swarm about the Hulk's bloody meat. Gargantuan battle barges came with them, slow and ponderous, trailing steams of decay and poisonous effluent. At length, when the blighted fleet had passed through the portals of its eternity, the wound in space snapped shut. Slowly the mass of non-dead matter and deceased steel that was the Death Guard reborn turned their bows towards distant Terra. That world was beheld in the eye of a gargantuan skeletal being, a towering hooded reaper, clasping a giant scythe in one clawed hand. He raised the other to point towards the glittering ember, flexing the muscles and the seething blood of his changed form in action. The order was given in silence. Lost in the dire shadows of his fathomless hood, Mortarion allowed himself to smile. When the Death Guard finally emerged from the warp, they were no longer the warriors they had once been. Their formerly gleaming ivory armor, adorned with notable jade heraldry of the Emperor's champions, was now sullied and stained with a sickly, unnatural pallor of greenish hues. The once proud forms, known for their resilience, had swollen to grotesquely inhuman shape. Every warrior had been transformed into something far worse than the previous. Their bodies, bloated and diseased, were pockmarked with boils, scabs, and rotting sores. The air itself around them was thick with a stench of corruption, as maggots crawled in their open, unhealing wounds, and black flies buzzed about them, carrying the taint of their plague-ridden state all about them. Their weapons, once finely crafted instruments of war, were now warped by the taint of Nurgle's ever-present sorcery, as they glowed with a sickly, lambent green warped energy, their surfaces now oozing with a gangrenous pus that never ended. The Death Guard had been reborn into real space, but they were no longer just Space Marines. No, they were Plague Marines, the very embodiment of decay and rebirth everlasting. They were no longer champions of the Emperor, but rather harbingers of pestilence, disease, and carriers of Nurgle's blight. Their transformation was not limited to the Death Guard alone, as Mortarion, the primarch who had once led them through the fires of the Great Crusade, had been forever altered. He grew taller, more gaunt, as though he had been stretched upon a rack. His once immense form, honed and powerful, had now become sickly and skeletal, a hollow shell that reflected the very essence of death. His once pristine battle plate had become fused with his bloated and deformed body, as it was now an instrument of decay. In return for the deliverance of himself and his sons from the agonizing torment of the warp, Mortarion had traded his soul for a terrible fate, as he was reborn as Nurgle's greatest demonic servant, the Prince of Decay, Nurgle's very own demon primarch. Mortarion was no longer the primarch of the Death Guard. No, he was the very embodiment of death, a living image of Nurgle's will, doomed to exist in an ever-present state of eternal decay and rejuvenation. He was condemned to feel every plague he would ever spread, simultaneously healing from it and being infected once again. Not only amongst his own legion, but throughout the galaxy, carrying with him disease and destruction of Nurgle's own twisted creation wherever he went, eternally cursed with unending pain and suffering. Every rasping breath of pain, every agonizing twist and popping boil, blistering flesh would be a torment unending that he would not only spread but also suffer from. Prior to the official commencement of the 4 Chaos-aligned legions' official foray into the Siege of Terra, discussions circled upon how they would proceed and distribute their forces, and eventually would break down as follows. "Then I shall land first," said Angron enthusiastically. "I shall come at them and cleave their bodies." "You will not," said another, a familiar voice, a quiet, rasping, sullen growl, but changed, thickened with phlegm. "I claim the task. My legion will be the first to attack the walls, as I pledged to the War Master months ago." Mortarion, primarch of the Death Guard, entered through the grand doors of Lubakal's court. This was not Mortarion as his brothers remembered him. He was changed, like Angron, Fulgrim, and Magnus, lifted by the Pantheon and given new form. Always amongst the tallest of the primarchs, he had grown further, his famine-spare frame pushed to great height, tattered moth wings furled on his back. The scythe silence had grown with its master, becoming as long as a Vox transmission pole. Mortarion appeared sickly, with his face scarred by disease and his eyes milky with cataract. Fluid wept from the craters of his deadly armor, while all around him swirled a dense, stinking fog. Where he passed the door, Abaddon's Justerian fell. Black fluid leaked from perished seals, and bloody phlegm coughed from their breathing gills. The sounds of armor closing itself against the environment filled the room. The Terminators suffered in the grip of sickness. Mortarion continued forward, felling Horus's elite by his very presence. "Back away from him," Abaddon commanded. "Seal the room." Atmospheric cyclers ceased turning. Machines bleeped out tones of compliance. Still, the Lord of Death marched forward. Cribe began to cough behind his mask. Aximund took several steps back, his face greening as he fumbled on his helm. Lyric dropped to his knees, singing praise in ear-burning tongues of his worship, but he too struggled to breathe Mortarion's miasma. Of all of them, only Horus, Tormageddon, and Abaddon were left unaffected. A stench wreathed the Lord of Death that defied any kinds of description. Human sense lacked the capacity to experience its fullness. So foul, so pungent with rot and sickly life was it, that it triggered Abaddon's homeophagia as he tasted a banquet of mireless sublime in their variety. It shook him to his soul that he could breathe. He looked to the others, choking on Mortarion's forter, and yet when the Primarch approached Abaddon, he inhaled easily, though the stench appalled him. Mortarion stopped a few feet from his brother's throne. Pearlescent eyes stared down into brown, both afire with inner power that was not of the mortal realm. His breathing labored, rattling in his lungs. Amix and Cribe dragged themselves back behind the throne, crawling as far as they could from the corrupted Primarch. Retching grated from Cribe's vox-emitter as he vomited into his helmet. Aximund pulled himself into a corner, managing to roll onto his back as he lay stupefied. The Lord of Death slammed the furl of silence upon the floor. "My War Master, I heed your call." With those words he knelt. The height his transformation had bestowed upon him meant that he was as tall as a seated War Master, even when he bowed. Abaddon suppressed a sneer. Such weakness. The Lord of Death traded his position as a Lord of Men to become a slave of the gods. Angron paced in and out of the field of view of his hollow emitter. Fulgrim giggled. Perturabo glared. "My brother, we welcome you," said Horus. "Rise." Bones popped as the Lord of Death stood again. "I come to fulfill my promise and lead the assault upon the palace." His voice, once a pure brass, was now a hoarse whisper. "You are greatly gifted by our patrons," Horus said, taking in his brother's form. "You will not be able to set foot upon Terra. I have patience. My sons will go before me and prepare the way." "They are ready," said Mortarion. "We bring weapons for an old war. My warriors have transcended the limitations of mortality. Nothing can harm them. While I have 7 plagues for you to unleash upon Terra, let the unseen soldiers of Bellicus and Virus reap the foe and add their deaths to the total." And when the tally pleases Father Nurgle, then I shall descend upon the palace and take my vengeance upon the false emperor. Eventually, after having been on the battlefield for long enough, the Khan, the primarch of the White Scars, found it prudent to specifically target Mortarion's sons, and it would go as follows. The Khan was alone, and the enemy saw immediately what prize was within their grasp. Hundreds of Mortarion's sons closed in from the fog, bolt guns blazing. His armor sparked with impacts. For a moment, it withstood the assault, but even his panoply was not immune to concentrated fire. The Warhawk lived by one rule of war above all others, one he learned the moment his adopted family were slaughtered by the Curides and born out in his war against the Palatine on Chagoris. Attack was the strongest form of defense. The Khan fought with a silent fury, charging into the ranks of the Death Guard, his talwar spinning in a blurring figure eight. He crashed into them without slowing, his sword cutting them down. Ceramite was atomized by the blade's disruption field. Viscera spilled onto the earth. Polluted blood showered him. Through his armor filters, he smelled the corruption upon Mortarion's sons. Theirs was a sickness of the flesh and soul. They fought slowly, without the finesseness of other legions, but the doggedness they were known for had been intensified by their fall into darkness. And no matter how many he killed, they persisted at him without cease. In the thick of them, he was safe from the firestorm they had unleashed. Hand-to-hand combat was on his terms, not theirs. The Death Guard favored disciplined lines and overwhelming close-range fire to bring down their enemies, taking whatever they received in return with grim stoicism. The Khan refused to allow them their preference, leaping amongst them, bearing down ranks before they formed. He fought unpredictably, throwing off the offensive of his foes, though he rushed them and pushed them back, or cut diagonally through their formation. Always the patterns of his movements took him closer to their defenses. If he was forced to take 50 steps away from the walls to throw them into disarray, he would take 51 back. His fury would have inspired thousands of bards, had any been able to see it. The fog made his fight a lonely struggle. Hidden from all knowledge, he faced the Death Guard alone, his Vox locator beacon jammed by haywire ordnance. The enemy died by the dozens, for not one was the match of a primarch. But though he fought like a god of old, he was but one being against an army, and not even the sons of the Emperor were tireless or supplied with infinite battle fortune. The first cut to break through his armor came after his 14th kill. A son of Mortarion lunged at the back of his knee while he was engaging 4 to the front. The weapon he sought to slay a primarch with was a simple combat knife, but perseverance pushed it through the armor ribbing of the joint seal. The Khan felt the blow as an angry hot sting, and the attacker paid for the injury with his life. The Khan smashed backwards with his talwar pommel, his emperor-given strength caving the ceramite perished by rot and the greening head beneath. He bellowed in anger, slashing across at transhuman chest height to drive back the assailant to his front. 3 of them died in a storm of disruption lightning, their innards laid open to the chemical fog. A 4th lost his arm, and a 5th took a blow to the head that spun him around and knocked him down. The Khan would have finished him, but he was reaching instead for his damaged left knee, trying to pull out a knife lodged in his suit. At the first attempt, his fingers slipped through the blood-slicked hilt, made for hands smaller than his own. His second attempt was foiled by a renewed attack. The knife penetrated 7 centimeters into his flesh, no more interfering minimally with the bones of his joint. He had suffered far worse from deadlier weapons and fought on, trusting to his engineered physiology to blunt the pain. He pressed forwards, but as he did so, he felt the strength running from his body along with his unstaunched blood. Another Death Guard died, then another. Explosives were raining down on him now from the enemy side, seeking him out as the 14th Legion shelled their own troops in their lust to slay a primarch. The Khan wondered if Mortarion saw his battle there, and grimly ordered his death, whatever the cost, to his son. There was a soulless pragmatism to the act, typical of the Lord of Death. The fog swirled with the rain of fire, lifting several of the horde of warriors in dirty white and green. A hotness spread from the piercing knife, infecting his blood with fever. Incredulous, the Khan fought still. But the touch of worry grazed his heart. Never in all his days had he been ill, but he instinctively recognized disease in him. He was human after all, on some distant level. His bones ached like ice. His flesh blazed, sweat dripped from his brow. He looked around at his brother's corrupted sons and wondered what an awful pact had been agreed to make them so, and give them the power to sicken a primarch. Mortarion, what have you done? He shouted. There was no answer. His body raised with the infection of the knife. Well-being came and went as the knife's poison overcame each trick his engineered physiology deployed. He scrabbled for the knife again as he fought, his great tulwar burning through the air to obliterate yet more of the traitors, but he could not take enough time to pull the knife free. It was so firmly embedded and too delicate for his fingers to easily plug out. A surge of bile rose across his throat as his limbs shook. He was slowing. The enemy were gathered closer, like the packs of hunters of ancient earth steppes, closing in on the great beast of those times. His next blow was weak enough to be turned aside. Arms clad in algae green gauntlets grappled with his forearm. With a bellow of anger, he wrenched himself free and stood for a moment unmolested before they surged forward, hacking and stabbing with more diseased weapons and dragging him down. The Khan of Khans ends his days, he thought, not upon a seat of grass in one final glorious charge, but dragged down and butchered in the mud. They wrestled with him, their filthy knives dragging grooves into his ceramite. They tried to get at the joints in his arms, groin, legs and neck, crawling on him like vermin. He threw them off, once, twice, but the third time was an exhausted heave. His body burned with disease, and strength left him. A creature of unclean god. It was no longer the Emperor's work. Brought forth a huge rusted axe for an executioner's stroke. I am Jagatai Khan, he shouted, the passion in his words driving them back. I am Jagatai Khan, loyal son of the Emperor, and I have ridden well. As the Death Guard prepared to bear down and end the Khan, the great angel would descend upon them, saving his brother, and through their combined effort, cutting down the traitor forces of the Death Guard. However, the two Primarchs' actions were not enough to draw down the chaotic energies that were being created by the sons of Mortarion, and eventually, Mortarion would be able to manifest alongside his brother, Magnus the Red, who was more or less forced to work with Mortarion in order to carry out Perturabo's strategy for a proper siege of the Imperial Palace. And after having sent Isaac Araman ahead of him, Magnus finally arrives at the side of his now manifested on Earth brother in order to coordinate and carry out the Lord of Iron's orders. However, this would be one of the few times where disobeying the orders of Perturabo would actually be helpful in any way for the traitors, as it did manage to mend some ties between Mortarion and Magnus the Red, and it would go as follows. The air writhed open as motes of dust swirled, furled, and swam together, forming a great pointed archway that looked as though it had been fused from calcified bone. Cold light burned through the archway. Mortarion turned, raising his hand to shield his eyes against the glare. Araman bowed. The light shifting through the skeletal arch dimmed, sucking back like a tide to be absorbed into the figure that stepped out. The arch cooled, blistered, turned to virtuous stone, and then flickered and blew away into the air. The Crimson King arrived. Ermin could not look up upon him. His glory was too raw and bright. You are late, said Mortarion. My brother, said Magnus, his radiance dulled, just as he had chosen the magnificence of his arrival to establish unequivocal power. Now he selected his form carefully. A human face, one eye socket simply empty, a helm of wide, downturned ivory tusk to subliminally suggest difference, a modest scale, gigantic still, but deftly measured to be slightly shorter than the towering shape of the Lord of Death. Plain plate, even the billowing silk overrobe were demure and unpatterned to indicate submission. I am glad to see you and stand with you, said Magnus. Mortarion glared. Araman rose again, watching and delighting in the Pale King's discomposure. I, Mortarion began. Be at ease, said Magnus. Please, we are both under instruction from our brother, Perturabo. We are to abide by his plan. I would not have chosen to discomfort either of us by standing shoulder to shoulder with you. The zone Imperialis is big, with many varied threats, but still, who am I to question the Lord of Iron's intricate scheme of war? The War Master has faith in his abilities, said Mortarion cautiously. So do I, brother, so do I, said Magnus. No finer exponent of siegecraft, so we are obliged. It seems so, said Mortarion. Magnus nodded. So, Colossi, your mighty strength and my qualities. I have no need of your qualities. I can crush this by myself, no doubt at all, said the Crimson King, but I go where I am sent. You seem wary, brother. Surely our old disagreements are behind us. You bring that up, I read it in your face, and I have always read yours, Crimson King, said Mortarion. Of your qualities, deceit has always been the uppermost. There is no deceit today, brother, said Magnus. That is why I came in person, to assure you. We are as one. We stand together. The Lord of Iron hath charged us with a task. We must be undivided. So let us take this moment to unburden ourselves of tiresome histories and reconcile. Things have changed. I say this of all this, so you must know I forgive you. You forgive me, Mortarion snarled. We are both now what you hated. It's unbearable, I know, the pain. The pain is nothing. The Pale King's voice was an empty husk. Magnus stepped closer to face him. The idea is not, he said as he looked Mortarion in the eyes. Your suffering gives you power, the sort I promised from the start. Your submission was not weakness. There is no shame. I bear you no ill will. I understand. It took the Pale King a moment to find his reply. I hate this, he whispered. I know, replied Magnus. It should ease your torment to know I harbor no resentment towards you. Not now. Magnus placed a hand gently on Mortarion's shoulder. The Pale King flinched slightly, warily. What are you doing? He growled. I have had my gift for a lot longer than you have, said Magnus calmly. Let me show you how they may be harnessed. A golden light seeped from Magnus's fingers and suffused Mortarion's ragged palate. Mortarion blinked, straightened slightly, and took a breath. He seemed taller, less bowed in pain and wrath. His eyes had become fierce and unclouded. You are kind to me, he murmured, puzzled. There is only one enemy now, said Magnus, the Lie Father. We face him side by side. The Pale King nodded as he clutched his fellow king's hand for a second, then turned away to look upon his scythe and stepped over the ragged battlement. They watched his giant figure bounding effortlessly from block to block, descending the slope of the rubble and calling for his captain. Compassion? Asked Ahriman. A temporary respite, Magnus replied. He is made to endure more than any of us, but pain dulled his abilities. He must learn to love what he is, or he will be of no use. And he and his legion are fine blunt instruments to crack the wall, to open the way, to let me reach the place I need to be. Eventually, the Khan and Mortarion would face each other once again. Mortarion, with his new craven god-given gift and rejuvenated by Magnus, felt much more in control and believed he'd be able to take out the Khan. As Mortarion dismissed the White Scars as simple barbarians, for him to swat aside and to be able to take over the Lionsgate spaceport. It was a mistake to think back, of course, because both of them had changed so much. The Lord of Death had burst free from his old bounds, becoming grotesque and monstrous. He wore a human form only in outline. Now his skinny body, inhabited by a ramshackle armor of corrosion and decay, a gaggle of loosely held panels, and moldy fabric, seemingly liable to fall apart at any moment. The air around him was acid, suffered with a foulness that turned the stomach and made it hard to breathe. He was ruined and yet exalted, crippled and yet stronger than he had ever been. So the old encounter meant little. Then it had been a matter of speed against intractability, and either approach could have emerged victorious. Now though, the parameters had changed. Mortarion's brute strength had grown obscenely. The warp coursed thickly through his veins, pulsing under heavily mutated skin. Whenever he moved, reality flexed around him, recoiling at the violation of natural law. His great blade displayed reflections of the hell realm beyond. Its rotting gardens, its tormented flesh, its fertile pain field. What did he, the Khan, have to set against all that? The old prowess with a blade, some fine armor, the residue of that famed quickness? Not enough. He had his hatred, though. That was different from before. On Prospero, the discord between them had been regretful as much as anything. Both of them disappointed at what was being thrown away by the other. Now his hatred was as infinite as the void. Too many had died at Kalthus for it to be any other way. His warriors, his ship, his counselor, all swallowed up by the monster before him, all owing their death to the single soul. The Khan had that. He had his rage, deep as the world's core, fueling every strike and sweep of the great Dao blade. He had the keen edge of vengeance to propel his limbs, to find a chink that could wound his horrific amalgam of posthuman and yaksha, to keep going against the impossible. They crashed together, then cracking the stone underfoot as they braced against it, the white tiger snarled itself on silence, releasing an explosion of mangled forces as they both pushed against the other, testing strength and poise, feeling the harmonics in their weapons and gauging what it meant for the strength of their bearers. Khan fell back first. They exchanged more rapid, heavier, faster. Around them, the roar of broader combat filtered up from the decks below, a chorus of screams and explosions that could not be filtered out. Their strikes accelerated, ramping up swiftly until the blows were exceptional in their heft and precision. Mortarion had sped up, his old solidity replaced by a phase-shifting demonic velocity, whilst arcs of his scythe hissed with unearthly voices, wounding the atmosphere itself. When the warp-forged steel connected, the impact was bone-breaking, mind-jarring, a collision of dimensions as much as solid matter. "I expected you to dance," the Death Lord grunted, hammering the Khan back further. "Lost your footing as well as your judgment?" The Khan was already breathing heavily. The going was hard as expected, harder maybe. There had never been any illusions. He worked his blade rapidly, its edge losing definition as the point whirled faster than thought. The scythe met it in an explosion of plasma and ceramite shards, swinging heavily, cracking with a hiss of imperfections of its half-formed demonic choir. "You are already defeated," the Khan told him. "You have become what you hated." Mortarion snorted. Some hatreds were never worth pursuing. Tell yourself that if it helped. The acceleration continued. The blows became denser than true mortal frames could ever have propelled. The combatants smashed in close, then reeled away into one of the gallery columns. The masonry cracked apart, driven into disintegrating dust clouds as the primarchs crunched their way clean through it. The Khan's armor took the first transverse slash, ripping the finery from the shoulder to the waist. Blood followed the path of the strike, splattering against the deck. They were alone now. They had entered the world of exclusivity, a level of combat no other being, Xenos or human, could hope to match, just to witness. To try and follow it was to invite a kind of madness. The primarchs kept themselves tightly under control, almost all the time wearing the trappings of mortality over their true natures. When they cast that off, they unlocked their inner selves. The result was difficult to watch, let alone intervene in. "Time has been cruel, Jagatai," Mortarion said, still calm, still fighting within himself, cracking the Khan away yet again, smacking the gold chasing from his helm, and rocking his head back. "You are not what you were. I am what I always was," the Khan snarled, driving back expertly against the flurry of heinously perfect blows, and raking plague centers free of their chains. Weak, loyal, same thing. The two of them barreled into the galley's external walls, hammering one another so fiercely that the entire section collapsed as if torpedoed. They swirled and dueled through the tumbling rubble, then into the exposed night air, completely absorbed now in their own private contest. The rest of the planet, the rest of existence, might as well have slipped away, shamefaced at the volume of physical brutality unleashed upon its surface. But that violence only ratcheted up, every second ticking over. More. Mortarion nearly took the Khan's head clean off with a vicious diagonal swipe. Silence's curved tip carved a 3-foot deep trench into the deck. When pulled out again, it ripped up whole clumps of static wreathed rockcrete. The Khan shouldered through the barrage to land a spiteful cut on the Death Lord's leading thigh, stripping the pox-riddled armor clean from the flesh and taking his first blood before being hammered back. They were out in the open then, lashing swings across one of the big landing stages, a kilometer across and 1,200 meters up. Above them, the storm raged, coursing through the green lightning that snapped down the high reaches of the spaceport, Below them, the bulk of the immense fortress spread out in a panoply of jumbled stages and terraces. Each inch of it was fought over now, a million points of light exposing white guards and death guard. It was as if the entire battle had found its apex, its distilled expression, so that all those thousands and thousands of individual duels created their gestalt combination at the summit of the decaying pile. "This isn't about revenge for me," said Mortarion, his rasping voice still contained. "You're just in the way now. You understand that." The Khan laughed bloodily, spitting out shattered teeth. "Now that I see it, brother," he hissed, "I'm here for you, nothing else." Mortarion backhanded him, cracking a savage hit into the Khan's throat before following up with a two-handed down thrust of the scythe. Indulgent, but then you always were. Another smack against the helm, a discharge of virulent nerve gas. Bit at the edge, the destruction of the Khan's pauldron, making him stagger. "I led my legion as I saw fit," the Khan snarled. "You might have tried the same." The white tiger flashed, going for the jingling cables at Mortarion's neck, but it was swatted aside. "I led the death guard before you were even found." The Khan held his ground against the onslaught, muscles screaming as they propelled his blade into dazzling arc. Sweat poured across his burning skin, mingling with blood now. "Not sure your first captain would agree." That unleashed the flood. Mortarion roared back at him, his gossamer wings rearing up as his mighty arms flailed. Furious and devastating, he crunched and bludgeoned the Khan out across the face of the landing, writhing him in plumes of poison, smashing his metal gauntlet, cracking his flanks with the shaft of his ether-snarled scythe, before plunging the curved edge back around and up into his torso. To endure all that, to not be completely swept away and broken into 1,000 pieces, took every scrap of skill and tenacity the Khan still possessed. By this point, he was fighting beyond anything he had ever achieved before, observing the boundaries of the possible and digging into the impossible, and he was still being battered, bruised, hammered, and driven across the storm-wrecked port edge. At this point, his right arm was fractured, his flank was lacerated, and his cheeks were shattered. Silence hung around him like the wheeling stars, its length cracking with vicious energies, both faster than the warp snarl and heavier than a star's heart. "You know nothing," Mortarion snarled, rearing up, his cloak whipping about him. "Nothing of sacrifice, nothing of denial. You were a spoiled child, whining about your need for structure as the rest of us built an empire." Mortarion's eyes flared with a maddened green tinge, his visible face twisted into true rage. He was an elemental. He was apocalyptic. He was phenomenal. The tempest shrieked around him that amplified every killing strike, tearing up ground as he scoured across, sending the remnants of the landing blasting towards the Khan and his retreating form. "You were shown the nature of the galaxy, and you turned away." Mortarion raged, slamming his scythe down, breaking the Khan's trailing leg in two. "I embraced it. I embraced the pain. I looked the god in the eye." "It ends here," Mortarion said, his face a rictus of anger. The Khan chuckled painfully under his lensless helm. "I see, but I'm laughing now, brother," he rasped, the thick blood in his throat making his words gurgle. "You should start to worry." The fight would continue and their clashes would intensify. Mortarion would snarl as he worked his scythe harder again, feeling his fatigue and muscles scream even as his mind reeled from the realization. As the Khan had started to dance, not with any beauty, that had been ripped away from him, but still with an unearthly slipperiness, that mesmerizing power appearing to be in one place, inviting the strike, only to be a hand's width away, just enough to drop under your guard and slice a piece of you away. "He could still do it when we do this with our ships," the Khan growled, no longer laughing, now deadly serious. "We call it Zao, the Chisi." Their blades clash again in an exploration of mangled warp detonations. The two of them both reeled away from the blow, barely able to keep their feet. He was damaged. He had hurt him, and the Khan came back quicker, his smashed ankles somehow propelling him across the erupted ground faster than Mortarion could react. When the dowel clanged against the scythe again, the blood splattered freely, but it was no longer just Jagatai. Mortarion swiveled on his heel as he smashed away the Khan. That sent the Primarch tumbling, but he came straight back again, lurching from his catastrophic injuries as if drunk, his devastated face etched with exertion, but he was still fighting through it, through all the forceful tolls of damage. It was as if some malevolent spirit had now animated him, pushing his ravaged body onwards until it achieved the absolution it needed. The sword spun faster, blurring across Mortarion's doubled vision, getting difficult to stop. The two of them traded earth-breaking blows clothes, tearing more of their priceless battle plates, smashing files and rupturing cables, severing chains' lengths as their cloaks were ripped to shreds and their finery destroyed, their raw selves exposed in blood and modded canvases of skin-stripped muscle. Their previous selves returned back to the primal truth. They were savage weapons, the numbered blades of an unwilling god. Mortarion was still the greater of them. He was still stronger, more steeped in the preternatural gift, but now all that he felt was doubt, rocked by the remorseless fury of one who had never been anything more than flighty, self-righteous, and unreadable. All Mortarion could see then was one who wished to kill him, who would do anything, sacrifice anything, fight himself beyond physical limits, destroy his own body, his own heart, his own soul, just for the satisfaction of the oaths he made into the void. "If you know what I did," Mortarion cried out, fighting on now through the cold fog of indecision, "then you know the truth, brother. I can no longer die." It was as if a final signal had been given. The Khan's bloodied head lifted, and the remains of his long hair hanging in matted clumps. "Oh, I know that," he murmured, with the most perfect contempt he had ever mustered, "but I can." Then he leapt. His broken leg still propelled him. His fractured arms still bore his blade. His blood-filled lungs and perforated heart still gave him enough power, and he swept in close. If he had been at the prime of condition, the move might have been hard to counter, but he was already held together by a force of will, and so silence interposed itself, catching the Khan and impaling him deep. But that didn't stop him. The parry had been seen, planned for, and so he just kept coming, digging himself up through the length of the blade until a scythe jutted out from his ruptured back, and the white tiger was tight against Mortarion's neck. For an instant, their two faces were right up against one another, both cadaverous now, drained of blood, drained of life, existing only as masks of pure vengeance, all of their majesty stripped away, scrapped out across utilitarian rock creep, leaving just desire, the violence of the brute mechanisms of desperate struggles. It only took a split second for Mortarion's eyes to widen, realizing that he could no longer wrench his brother away in time. As the Khan's eyes narrowed, that makes the difference, severing Mortarion's neck cleanly in an explosion of black bile before collapsing into his own warp explosion that turned the landing stage briefly into the brightest object on the planet after the Emperor's tormented soul itself. Shortly after this, the Khan would be retrieved, his near-death state pushing his sons into a righteous frenzy that overwhelmed, at least temporarily, the sons of the now slain Mortarion. Eventually, they would attack the Lion's Gate spaceport once again, but by then, the White Scars had retreated, with their primarch in tow, and the defense was largely taken up by the Dark Angels under the command of Cypher. And eventually, this second push would be overwhelmed once more by the Loyalist forces, reigniting the Astronomicon through faith, pushing back the Sons of Mortarion, leading to their end in the participations of the Siege of Terra. Though the Siege of Terra ultimately ended up in the Emperor's victory and the tragic fall of Horus Lupercal, the fate of the Death Guard would not follow the same path as the other traitor legions. The Death Guard, under their command of their now demonic Primarch Mortarion, did not flee in disarray into the Eye of Terror as their fellow legions had. Rather, they made an orderly withdrawal, one marked by an unwavering uniformity. As the forces of the Imperium pressed forward, driven by the Emperor's wrath, Mortarion and his Death Guard would have their forces broken upon the Emperor's lines, their bodies essentially lost to the weapons that the remaining loyalists now had, as they reaped a glorious vengeance upon the traitors. Upon reaching the Eye of Terror, Mortarion claimed his new dominion, a demon world known as the Plague Planet. This world was a toxic, festering wasteland. Ironically enough, it was a perfect place for Mortarion to shape into a reflection of his own new nature, one of disease, decay, and unrelenting horror, and it would become his home, a place from where to launch his unholy campaigns into the material universe from. It was not long before Nurgle, the plague god, recognized Mortarion's accomplishments and promoted him to the rank of the greatest of his demon princes. Mortarion had at last achieved what he had long desired, a world of his own. Yet it was not a world of proud and pristine consequence that he had once sought, but a corrupted, agonizing land of suffering and decay. In this dark reflection of his new existence, Mortarion had come to rule, as a lord of rot and the sovereign of the Plague Planet. For Mortarion's sons, the Death Guard, their new existence was marked by a wide range of responses to their transformations and to their overall loss during the Siege of Terra. Some found themselves to fully embrace the blessings of Nurgle, celebrating their new forms, convinced in their arrogance that they had been chosen chosen as the most worthy to receive Nurgle's favor. They believed, having passed through the eye of the needle of this transformation, they had proven themselves not just worthy of their new master, but uniquely superior to all other mortals, including those of the other God-aligned forces. These warriors reveled in their new power granted to them by the Plague Lord. Their hearts hardened against every notion of weakness as they saw themselves as truly eternal, beyond the touch of normal decay, sustained by the very will of their new god, Grandfather Nurgle. Others, however, found their new existences far less satisfying. These warriors could not forget that the plague had laid them low, and in their minds, this transformation signified a weakness they could never accept. To them, Nurgle's blessings were no gift that must be repaid with destruction. They sought not only to embrace their new forms, but to spread the plague across the galaxy and bring the entire universe down to their level. For these warriors, there was no peace in their condition, only madness in the relentless ruin they would bring. Then there were those who had been driven to true madness in the depths of suffering. These individuals exhibited twisted behaviors, sometimes indulging in gleeful rambunctiousness, other times sinking into an ever-present melancholy. In the end, Mortarion's legion had become what they had long since accepted: chained servants of Nurgle, body and soul bound in eternal servitude to the Plague God. Though their forms had been changed, their fates had been sealed, as they would remain devoted to Nurgle's insidious will. And as the millennia passed, this devotion would only grow stronger. With each passing century, their connection to their deity deepened, and their desire to spread decay across the galaxy only intensified. As the Death Guards, once champions of the Emperor, had now become true instruments of rot, destruction, and endless pestilence. Mortarion had finally found his home, and so had his legion, but rather one where they were embraced and their ideologies remained firm. They were bowed, as this was a home of corruption, decay, and an eternal war as the Plague God's servant, who would carry forth the will of their Dark Lord, sowing pestilence, despair, and death across the galaxy until the Imperium would fall, or until all life in existence was consumed by the rot of their plague. The Death Guard's legacy was one of decay, and there would be no redemption for them, no salvation, only Nurgle's foul blessings for eternity. Even today, in the 41st millennium, Mortarion's grip over the Death Guard remains absolute. His existence continues as a shadow over the galaxy, a perpetual reminder of the consequences of the heresy. Mortarion, the Prince of Decay, still lingers, as his powers were undiminished by the passage of millennia. And recently, Mortarion has reemerged into real space for the first time since the fall of Horus. He has led the Death Guard in what became known as the Plague Wars, targeting the realm of Ultramar during the era Indomitus, a time where the galaxy was torn asunder once more. Here the Death Guard launched their assault from the Cadian Gate, their influence spreading beyond the veil of the eye into the wider galaxy, and the Death Guard are now relentless in their mission to spread the terrible blessings of Grandfather Nurgle, their malevolent patron. Wherever their forces travel, they bring with them joyful, exuberant gift of the Plague God, infecting their enemies with plagues and offering them an eternal life twisted by the diseases ridden into them by the will of Nurgle. Each pestilence they carry further deepens their devotion to their master, as their wars against the Imperium rage on. Meanwhile, Typhon, once merely a servant of Mortarion, has taken up a new role. Now known as Typhus the Traveler, he forsook his master's direct command and struck out on his own to spread the pestilence of Nurgle far and wide. Typhus became a terror in his own right, acting as an agent of corruption, delivering the Plague God's gift to the Emperor's followers. His campaigns grew more and more daring and destructive over time, especially during the 13th Black Crusade, where he secured a plague-ridden stronghold, cementing his status as a feared Lord of Chaos. The Death Guard, now under both Mortarion's leadership and Typhus's independent efforts, have not simply survived the passage of time, they have flourished in their malevolent purpose. Mortarion, forever bound to the will of Nurgle and Typhus, now an even greater threat, continue to spread ruination wherever they go. Their devotion to decay, disease, and the worship of the Plague God has only deepened with the passing of the ages. As the Death Guard's influence continues to spread, one must ask, can the Imperium ever fully stop the forces of Nurgle? Is there any true hope of curbing the decay Mortarion and Typhus have unleashed? With the Plague Wars still ongoing and remain a consistent, corrupting presence upon the galaxy, their victories in the heresy only being the beginning of a war waged for a lifetime. The Plague Wars stand as one of the most horrific and insidious campaigns ever waged by the forces of chaos, led by the demon primarch Mortarion and his Death Guard, the once proud champions of the Imperium. This war was an effort to expand the influence of the Chaos God Nurgle, the Plague God, into the very heart of the Imperium's most outstanding stronghold. Their target was the realm of Ultramar, the home of the esteemed Ultramarines, and the legacy of Reboot Guilliman. This was a bastion and a key position of power for the Imperium. The Plague Wars began in the aftermath of the Great Rift tearing open the skies, that vast tear within reality that split the galaxy asunder and ushered in the era known as Noctis Aeterna, a time of nigh perpetual darkness. While the precise beginning of this conflict remains mostly lost to history and covered in a mortuary shroud of uncertainty, the war itself can be traced back to the opening salvos of the 41st millennium, and it stretched undeterred by the Imperium's many struggles, to the point that by the end of 111 M42, the war had not only ravaged Ultramar, but it had spread its pestilent influence across countless star systems. The origins of the Plague Wars are often debated. Some claim that the first hostilities took place just prior to the opening of the Great Rift, suggesting that Nurgle's minions had been preparing for this campaign for centuries. What is clear, however, is that the Plague Wars spanned an incredibly wide area of the galaxy, with its most concentrated battles taking place within the realm of Ultramar, the home of the Ultramarines. The deathless forces of Nurgle, led by Mortarion, came in unending waves, each more terrifying than the last, as they swept across the star systems of Ultramar, and their forces were bolstered by the uncountable hordes of plague demons, chaos cultists, and traitor Astartes alike. Amongst the diseases unleashed, these maladies spread with such a virulent ease that entire worlds fell to them, and their populations reduced to swarming diseased husks of what they once were. The population of these once thriving systems now faced a grim fate: succumb to the pox or become twisted abominations and vessels for Nurgle's eternal gift. As the diseases ran rampant across the galaxy, they overwhelmed Imperial defense lines. The Imperium's forces, though formidable, were ill prepared for the relentless assault, and the Death Guard, transformed into Plague Marines, took the brunt offensive. Their tenacity, strengthened further by the gifts of Nurgle and the aeons spent wallowing within the warp-rich energies of the Plague Planet, allowed them to continue to push deeper and deeper still into Imperial space, undeterred by the stalwart and ever-present resistance from the Ultramarines. Though the Plague Wars have seen moments of relative dormancy, the forces of chaos retreating or regrouping, it has never truly ceased. These intervals of intermittent quiet were merely the calm before another eruption of pestilence and plague, during the times the warriors of the Imperium believed victory was within their grasp. Nurgle's forces would rise once more, overwhelming them with a renewed vigor. The Plague Wars, as they are understood by the Imperium, remain a conflict without clear boundaries. There's not simply cordoned off lines of conflict confined to Ultramar, but it also stretches northward into an area known as the Scourge Stars, a region of space once prosperous with worlds now being consumed by the pervasive spread of Nurgle's diseases. As the Plague God's corruption spreads further, entire systems become engulfed in sickness and in unending despair. It is here that the forces of chaos under Mortarion's command have made a mark, and the Imperium remains locked in an ongoing, unending battle against Nurgle's forces. The Indominus Crusade under Reboot Guilliman would eventually come to stymie the unceasing threat of Mortarion's legion, as Mortarion's already large invasion force had been bolstered by mutant cultists and warriors from the Scourge Stars. He was also at this point accompanied by Typhus, a plague fleet, and a great unclean one named Kugroth, who led a host of 7 greater demons of Nurgle, called the Plague Guard. Their strategy was centered around holding a few major planets, including Esplendor and Connor, while launching raiding attacks and seeding nearby systems with further poxes and diseases. Mortarion's partial conquest of the Esplendor system opened up the gateway for a direct invasion fleet to surge into Ultramar proper. The planets of Iax were overrun by Nurgle demons rather quickly, allowing the bulk of their invasion force to be bared upon the Ultramarines. This would be their base of operations and the point of attack for the entirety of their invasion of Ultramar proper. Mortarion, his Death Guard, and the rest of the Plague Guard would gather at this point before moving forward. as Macragge would suffer collisions with chaos-induced unrest, as Mortarion sent probing attacks to the Ultramarines' homeworld, both of Space Marines and from cultists. While they were not able to spread large amounts of destruction through these tactics, they drew out more and more of Marneus Calgar's defense forces away from the planet's actual defense and had them redistributed in peacekeeping missions. This would allow Typhus, along with his own plague fleet, to overrun at least one or more of Ultramar's star force before attacking a Ultramarine stronghold on the world of Barimo. However, hearing of his power base coming under attack, Guilliman eventually returned to Ultramar away from his Indominus crusade, bringing with him thousands upon thousands of Primaris reinforcements. First, he directed his men to cleanse the hive world of Ardium in the Macragge system from every last shred of the Death Guard. There, he discovered Mortarion was using the Hand of Darkness to craft new plague engines, all the while reanimating the dead and using them as a plague of undead horrors. And he would quickly put a stop to this and stymie the Nurglite influence within the area. He then quickly headed over to Macragge and offloaded thousands of Primaris Marine reinforcements, along with other allies, including uncountable numbers of Astra Militarum and Navis Imperialis troops. He would then go on to organize the Ultramarines to launch a large-scale counterattack against the invaders, as he also drew upon several Ultramarine successors, their fleets engaging the Death Guard in near legion numbers, and doing their best to successfully keep Ultramar's shipping lanes safe, for it was through logistics that the Ultramarines would be able to outdo the Death Guard. Guilliman quickly set his eyes on retaking the Splendor system, which would essentially cordon off Mortarion and cut off the Death Guard's primary supply line. He would go on to retake each and every world, systematically destroying the engines that were created to plague zombies and other munitions, freeing the entire planets from the influence of chaos in short order, destroying all the zombies upon these planets and their sources in quick but rather decisive battles. Guilliman would then give a true death to one of Nurgle's greater demons, Cormac, using the Emperor's sword, destroying him permanently despite his god's best efforts to avoid so, as at this point, Guilliman was wielding one of the few weapons in existence who could give a demon a true death. With their supply lines to the Scourge Stars cut and their plague engines utterly destroyed, along with further Imperial reinforcements pouring into Ultramar with each passing day, Mortarion found himself on the back foot. This was a war of attrition, and unfortunately, Guilliman had the better supply line, so despite his own men's resilience, Mortarion was forced to back off. But rather than doing the logical thing, backing off, regrouping before launching another assault, Mortarion decided to throw all his remaining forces at one target. Since Macragge was still too heavily defended, the forces of Nurgle decided to assault a different target, the Ultramarines world of Barmino, and this would see the biggest clash between the traitors and the loyalists, as the Ultramarines would use their largest star fort, Galatan, to provide as much support as possible in engaging the Plague Fleet, as they also bombarded the Traitor Marines with everything they had. However, this was not without a price. The chapter master of the Nova Marines would pass on, allowing Guilliman and the Ultramarines to slowly whittle down their opponent. Guilliman killed another one of Nurgle's greater demons and shattered the Plague Guard, giving the Loyalists the upper hand to make gains. Eventually, there would be a direct confrontation, and Mortarion and Guilliman would fight. Herein, Mortarion would inject Guilliman with a disease known as the God Blight, what is believed to be Nurgle's most potent disease ever, essentially winning the fight. However, things would change swiftly as the tides of the Imperium shifted away from the favor of the Plague God. The moment fled back into the past, where it belonged. Guilliman's body slammed into wet soil. He was dying again. His soul clung on, but it too was being eaten alive by Mortarion's plague. Footsteps halted by his head. There was a poke at his breastplate upon the armor of fate. Guilliman then heard Mortarion speak, but he could not see, and he could not sense anything other than pain. "Do you seek Guilliman? You followed the wrong master," said Mortarion. "He is a cyst, pus-filled canker surrounding a dead thing lodged in the fabric of reality, like a thorn or a piece of shrapnel. It must be drawn out for things to heal. Do you understand now? This is what you follow?" Mortarion grunted in amusement. "Of course you can't answer. I doubt you could understand anyway." There was a sound of Mortarion's shifting stance as a wistful tone entered his voice. "We will soon be in the Garden of Nurgle, my brother. The veils are parting. I can see it already. Once you are dead, this world will fall with it and become a jewel of decay. You have damaged my network, but not by enough. And at the coming of your death, one by one, each of your worlds will pass from this place of cold void, uncaring stars into the grandfather's embrace. I wish you could see it. It is beautiful, full of life and potential. There are trees there and plants of amazing variety. It is not barren. It is not like that cold light you showed me. Not like him. It is not like the Imperium at all, with its pointless struggle against inevitability. Here, nothing truly ever ends, but it is reborn and dies, and is reborn and dies over and over again. Everything here is given many gifts. Nothing, no matter how small, is overlooked, and all share in the grandfather's bounties. There is no pain, because there is no pain. Suffering is born gladly. Now tell me, brother, compared to that hell our father inflicted upon the galaxy, does that sound terrible?" "I wish you could see it," he said. The pain still raged through Guilliman, but it was diminishing. "If only you would turn. You are nearly dead. Soon the pain will be over." Mortarion knelt beside his brother and rested a hand on his chest. "Don't you want that for it to be done?" He began to stroke, like he was soothing a feverish child. "Hush now, Reboot. Hush. Go to the grandfather, and you will see. He will make all things right. He will take the pain away forever." The garden shook with an earthquake. Strange demonic creatures that dwelled there set up a cacophony of cries and moans. On the areas of lax it overlaid, reality trembled as it reasserted itself, and the garden began to fade. "Impossible," Mortarion whispered. The corpse of his brother twitched. The armor of fate was a corroded shell, but somehow its power pack restarted as lights blinked on the systems all over it. Guilliman's blackened face turned up to look at him. Mortarion felt something huge and dangerous moving through the warp, something he had not felt in a long time. Guilliman's back arched. The armor was humming now, giving off a psychic signature of arcane mechanisms. The earth would shake once again. A second toll of an unseen bell sent the denizens of the garden into an uncontrollable frenzied panic. Trees cracked as they dragged up roots and attempted to lumber away. A million kinds of demon fly buzzed up from the corpse grounds and flew away in gathering swarms. Nurglings shrieked and waddled as fast as they could, and Mortarions raising silence in an attempt to bring it down as fast as possible to destroy Guilliman and finally take his soul as a sacrifice to the greater god Nurgle, even if it could not take his words. But he could no longer move, as Guilliman's eyes were glowing with a pure power. The last slimes of his decayed flesh burned away, and a network of feathery capillaries spread in their place, bringing in new blood unsullied by the god blight. The metal of the armor of fate shimmered, impossibly remaking itself. Bright decorations appeared as tarnished and cracked armor fell away. Wires grew anew and reconnected as surely as Guilliman's skin was growing back. The never ground of the garden shook hard as the demons, large and small, were screaming and scurrying away, emerging from their hiding places and fleeing in a raucous stampede. The ground would finally break as Guilliman's corpse fully rose and spoke. "He speaks through me, brother. Does he not speak to you?" The now godly, undeniable radiance of Guilliman caused Mortarion to have to lift his hands to protect his eyes as he asked, "Father," in a tone mirroring that of a young child, discovering that his father knew he had done something wrong. "I am his right hand, brother," Guilliman spoke. "I am his general, his champion, his avenging son. By his might am I preserved." The landscape flickered between the blasted battlefield of Yak and Nurgle's garden, as the ground of the garden was rolling, giving way under the power. "This is impossible. You should be dead," Mortarion screamed, a panic coursing through his very body. "You are a traitor," Guilliman's voice spoke, but it was not quite his. "You have brought low all that could have been, but you are as much a victim as a monster, Mortarion. Perhaps one day you might be saved. Until then, you must go to the master you chose." "No," Mortarion cried, but it was too late. Some force reached for him and yanked him back as he flew back over and over through the gardens towards the black house of the plague god. He felt a moment of perfect terror before he flew through the open portal and it slammed shut behind him, trapping him altogether with a more powerful god. Nurgle was displeased as Guilliman looked over the garden. He was now between worlds. The warp was shifting, constantly changing, never consistent. The garden was a collection of ideas as it had no true form, though it was a sea of a million other worlds which underpinned it. The dreams of the souls living and dead. And past that, still, as if glimpsed through the blinks of a glittering sea mist, evaporated before the morning sun. Hear me, Guilliman's voice boomed, his father's blazing sword burning brighter than it ever had before, as it threatened to burn out reality around it. I am Reboot Guilliman, the last loyal son of the Emperor of Terra. It is not your destiny to end today, God of Plague, but know that I am coming for you, and I will find you, and I will burn you. He gripped the sword of the Emperor in a two-handed grip, raising it high as waves of fire ripped into the garden. From the burning inferno, a mass of screams came, as a flame hotter than a million suns, burning a million times for a million years, erased everything from its path, finally breaking and receding just yards away from the black walls of home, his stronghold, as its infinite halls shook and mossy tiles fell from its roof. Sodden timbers steamed as parts of Nurgle's garden were permanently burned away. I speak for the Emperor of Mankind. Then Guilliman fell, and he fell and fell back into reality. The sword of the Emperor would be buried point down into the cracked earth, as its fires turned everything to the ground below him to glass, as burnt out suits of armor from the Death Guard were littered around him. Only he was unscathed. Mortarion no longer to be seen, and he stood. Whatever presence that had previously inhabited and empowered him was now gone. The air was clean, and there was no sign of taint nearby. And he knew that the Emperor's sword had burned not only the godblight away, but permanently erased many a Death Guard and uncountable scores of demons from reality, permanently erasing them from existence. Reboot Guilliman would tell Maldor Cloquin, "It is done. Mortarion is gone. His network is broken, and the Plague Wars are over." He would then proceed to sheath the Emperor's sword and teleport away. With Mortarion's defeat, Reboot Guilliman seized the opportunity to stabilize the Imperium's defenses, overseeing the rebuilding of the realm of Ultramar, and instituting decontamination efforts across the systems that had previously been infected by the Death Guard. Under Guilliman's command, humanity began rebuilding in these sectors, their forces preparing for the next phases of the war. They understood that while the Plague Wars may be over, the conflict against the Death Guard was far from it, even as Guilliman directed Imperial efforts to recover from the plague-infested onslaughts. New Imperial crusades demanded his presence elsewhere, pulling him back into the wider galaxy, leaving the Ultramarines to continue the long process of recovery. But for this moment, respite would not last long, as, much like Nurgle's plagues, the Death Guard's cycles of war are eternal. Yet the Ultramarines had been hardened by the Plague Wars and began preparing for the inevitable return of Nurgle's servants. Though the Death Guard was thought to be temporarily beaten back, they had left their mark, and some of their forces had moved to incursions upon Imperium Nihilus. Yet they would not be forgotten. As the Imperium fortified its borders with new war machines, the forces of the Dark Gods still lurked within the shadows, waiting, ever patiently, for the right moment to strike, as this was a war of attrition, and this was a war that the Death Guard was more than prepared to fight.